What's up guys, Derek, moreplates.com. Today we're going to be talking about Sigma. This is a product that was made in collaboration with Andrew Huberman, as well as Dr. Kyle Gillette and numerous other individuals who I have met over the last couple of years who, I feel have very high quality information, insight into the endocrine side of things, and have otherwise piqued my interest because I was actually super skeptical about testosterone boosting ingredients. There are a lot of dumb things out there that are put into products like aromatase inhibitors and things of this nature that, I guess in certain contexts can make sense, but it's very context dependent. And again, I've expressed my concern with this, indiscriminately inhibiting aromatase in all tissues of the body, like your brain, your heart, etc., just to get a transient spike in total testosterone on paper. Because again, if you're inhibiting the aromatase enzyme, obviously you'll get a spike in T. It's just like if you inhibit 5-alpha reductase with finasteride, what do you expect? An increase in testosterone on paper. But is it a clinically significant one that's actually going to improve your quality of life? Or is it going to be deleterious? This is something that is ultimately up for interpretation. Obviously DHT inhibition, DHT is something that pushes you through puberty and actually gives you maturation, sexual differentiation. But once you're in adulthood, DHT for the maintenance of, secondary sexual characteristic development is not really, a necessity necessarily. You get through puberty, and as long as you had adequate DHT to get through puberty, you've made it to adulthood. You're a fucking male. You're a full-grown man at this point with a fully grown dick. But with estrogen, this is something that is required all through your life for neuroprotection, cardioprotection, libido, quality of life. So many different things come from estrogen. There's a reason why neurodegeneration and cardiovascular disease spikes like fucking crazy when women hit menopause. It is literally the systemic crushing of estrogen production, and obviously the lack of quality of life from no testosterone and whatnot, and their hormones just crashing into nothingness. So again, it's obviously crucial in males too. So I was never a huge fan of pursuing that avenue solely for testosterone boosting as a natural supplementation regimen. So anyways, when I heard Andrew go on Joe Rogan talk about testosterone optimization, I was pretty skeptical. And frankly, I hadn't looked into these ingredients that thoroughly because I always just assumed this stuff is bullshit, That's what I thought. So he talks in here about how he's heard or experienced personally actually too, increases in up to 200 points on Tongkat Ali, and he's seen upwards of 400 to 500 increases in total T in nanograms per deciliter with the combination of Fadogia Agrestis and Tongkat Ali. So he talks about it here on Joe Rogan. This is what ultimately got my interest really peaked and kind of the hype train going around some of these, herbs and, exotic compounds that are naturally occurring in nature and what they can actually do for you.
But there's a category of supplements that are very interesting that for most people who aren't exploring testosterone augmentation for sport work very well to increase testosterone by about 100 to 200 points. Not, 300, not a tripling or anything like that. And the main ones are two substances. One is called Tongkat Ali.
Oh yeah, that stuff's real, huh?
Yeah. Oh yeah, because what happens is the testosterone molecule, it's basically carried in a cargo. So it can be in its free form, unbound form, free testosterone. And everyone says, oh, I want more free testosterone. You want more, but these what are called sex hormone binding globulins. So there's something called sex hormone binding globulin and albumin. They carry the testosterone molecule to the different tissues of the body. So you don't want all your testosterone free. You want some of it bound up so that it can be delivered to the different tissues, including your brain. But if you have too much sex hormone binding globulin, the testosterone can't really do its things, okay? So Tongkat Ali, about 400 milligrams per day, has the effect of raising free testosterone and overall testosterone by about 100 to 200 points. Now, for people that aren't getting prescribed TRT but want the increase in testosterone, there are these plant compounds like Tongkat Ali and another one which is very interesting. It's a Nigerian shrub called Fadogia Agrestis, and it mimics luteinizing hormone, which is the hormone that comes out of the hypothalamus that stimulates the testes if you got those and the ovaries if you've got those to make more testosterone or estrogen. And so those two herbal supplements together can give a significant boost in free and active testosterone.
So you said Tongkat Ali can give you 100 to 200?
Yeah, about that.
Well, what does the other one give you?
Fadogia is usually taken at about 600 milligrams And that can, the most dramatic effect I've ever seen was somebody who had his testosterone down in the low twos, or I think it was like low twos, and he got it up to the 700 range, but
Really?
that's an outlier, right? Most people are going to see about a 300 to 400 point increase.
And that's what the two of them synergistically
Fadogia
working?
will actually make the testes grow. It's a noticeable difference. So
everybody wants that.
Well, the reason I know about this stuff, people are probably thinking like, Huberman's running gear out of the back of his car or something. That's not what this is about. Is that I do a certain amount of work with military, and I do a certain amount of work with professional athletes who cannot take androgen compounds out of a syringe because they'll lose their job.
Right.
Or they've been doing that and they want to come off.
So, I saw that, and this is before Andrew and I were, talking, kind of going back and forth with our own personal insights on hormone augmentation, endocrinology, pharmacology, etc. I ended up digging into it in a reaction video shortly after it was posted, and you could, in the comment section, you could just see the expectation that I was going to react to it, which, it was a fucking right up my alley, dude. So I did. And for me, again, I was hypercritical because I found that Tongkat, and specifically, seemed to act as a SERM. It had similar activity to a selective estrogen receptor modulator called Novadex, which a lot of you are probably familiar with. Tamoxifen, one of the primary post-cycle therapy drugs used in a post-cycle context after coming off of a steroid cycle. When you're suppressed, it can otherwise inhibit estrogen feedback to the hypothalamus pituitary testicular axis, and then allow your body to uptick its production of GnRH, which then will subsequently lead to a spike in LH and FSH and increase your fertility. You expedite your recovery, essentially. If you're occupying estrogen receptors and preventing negative feedback, and essentially, this is used in, gyno prevention or reversal in some cases to some extent, or attenuation of it. There are a lot of different contexts in which Novadex is deployed, but in general, you're essentially occupying the estrogen receptor and providing inhibiting the feedback to your HPTA in order to expedite some sort of fertility metrics. So ultimately, I'm okay, chronically, that doesn't seem like the best idea, but it's obviously it's superior to aromatase inhibition for if somebody was going, for example, if somebody was on cycle and they had, gyno flaring up, obviously the answer long-term would be getting the gyno removed. However, if you were trying to inhibit, estrogen-induced RNA transcription at the receptor site in your breast, you would probably be better off with using a SERM that has selective estrogen receptor modulation rather than indiscriminately inhibiting aromatase all around your body. So that is where a SERM is a more viable alternative for estrogen inhibition of its action, essentially. But in a chronic supplementation context, I was okay, well, if this is the only mechanism of action, I don't see this as a thing that makes sense for more than a transient period of time. But after looking into it more, it seems and again, I was actually skeptical of the understanding of even what the MOA was, the mechanism of action. I actually did a podcast with Andrew shortly thereafter expressing kind of my skepticism, my concerns around these two supplements, because Tongkat, again, acts as a SERM. Fadogia, though, mimics LH supposedly. And I was how the fuck is this thing working? And there was also data on toxicity in the seminiferous tubules of rodents specifically, which gets at a bit of criticism, among those who dig into the literature and kind of are, you see on one camp, this massive increase in testosterone, which we'll get into the studies shortly. But on the other hand, you also see in rodents that at certain dosages, you start to get a level of toxicity, which, obviously is a cause for concern. And I hadn't seen many people dig into, but at the same time, a lot of people who were it's not it was covered that extensively, but other people who are in the science-based supplementation realm of things or reviewing things dug into it and saw some cause for concern, which I expressed the same concern, which I kind of grilled Andrew on in this clip here from our full podcast. If you haven't checked out the full podcast, please do check it out. I think it's really good. And in here we talk about these two supplements in particular.
In my early 40s, I started trying a huge range of over-the-counter supplements one by one while doing blood work. I have a spreadsheet that's just super extensive. These are just my personal data, but all the things that you hear out there, I didn't try all of them, but I tried a number of them. Most of them didn't work for me. The two things that were effective for me were ones that I've talked about before. And then I should mention, I have no financial relationship to these, and I'm not recommending anyone take them. I'm just reporting my experience, which were 400 milligrams of Tongkat Ali. Turns out that there's Malaysian version of this and there's an Indonesian version. And the Indonesian, I'm getting reports back now from people that are out there that have heard me talk about this, that it's the Indonesian version that's particularly potent, and the Malaysian version might not be at all. So this is an ongoing thing, but that combined, it's supposed to lower sex hormone binding globulin. My bound T wasn't particularly high, but my free T wasn't particularly high either. So Fadogia Agrestis at 600 milligrams, which is actually 1/3 of what's recommended on the bottle.
How did you stumble across that anyway? Because like I could understand the Tongkat, because that's like a very, very like I don't know, like well-established, kind of like long-standing. If you were going to say what are the natural T boosters, most people have heard of Tribulus. Not that I'm saying it's good. I'm just saying what people have heard of. People have heard of Tribulus. People have heard of, Maca, maybe. They've heard of Tongkat Ali, Long Jack. But then Fadogia, like I had never heard of it before you started talking about it. Like, how did you end up stumbling across that?
Yeah. A friend who is also a endocrinologist, and I got into a conversation about plant compounds that affect the endocrine systems of the animals that eat them. And there are a lot of plants make compounds that are out there to adjust the fertility and or populations of the animals that forage on them. Yeah. And so I thought, well, this is kind of an interesting compound, and it was available. I took it, and for me, those two things combined, again, just for me, led to about I basically increased that number to high 7s, low 8, 800 nanograms per deciliter. Maintained that for several years. Definitely. People ask, was I cycling it? Yeah, every 3 or 4 months or so, I'd come off for 8 weeks or so. Was monitoring my liver enzymes and other profiles. I thought, well, this is pretty interesting. And then some of the communities that I've consulted for started showing me data from their use, and it was like pretty interesting. And so I've seen a range of responses. So let me be very clear. Sourcing is key. I think there's probably a huge range of quality out there. There's not a lot of data on safety out there. Everyone has to monitor those things for themselves. There's not a ton of data on mechanism. It's more hypothesized mechanism. Here's what's interesting. Fadogia agrestis seems to increase luteinizing hormone in a non-positive feedback or negative feedback type way. So in other words, it'll raise luteinizing hormone sometimes into supraphysiological ranges, and doesn't seem to shut down natural luteinizing hormone production.
So FSH concurrently doesn't budge, but LH just singularly increases?
Yeah, which is kind of interesting.
I'm assuming I don't even think this would be based on I don't know if this would be an accurate way to determine, but have you seen anybody's gonadotropin releasing hormone assessment before and after using it? Because I'm wondering, because I'm thinking how would you singularly heighten LH and not? I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it could be that it's actually having a direct effect on the pituitary, but that's a speculation. The most dramatic shifts I've seen were when people were suffering from symptoms of low testosterone. So a couple individuals that were down in the mid 200s. These are nanogram per deciliter, obviously 200s. Took them and saw huge, enormous increases, like up to high 8s, low 9. But then again, people have written to me and said, I didn't see a few. I would say only a select number of people have written to me and said, I didn't see anything. It was a modest bump.
Were those sustained increases going from like literal hypogonadal territory up to 700, 800?
Yeah. And who knows whether I haven't been in touch with them in the last 6 months or so, but I would imagine I would have heard from them if things weren't going well. And then there's some people who are in their 70s who, were not interested in TRT. Again, I wasn't recommending this. They just heard me talk about it, took it and seemed to
report subjectively just better feelings of well-being, strength in the gym, slight libido increases, etc. Okay, so that was essentially 5 years, and then when I on my 45th birthday, the new year of my 40, after my 45th birthday, I'm working on a book essentially about hormones and their relationship to the brain, and so my numbers were sitting in the, as I mentioned, in the mid 7s, low 8s kind of thing.
Before we get into your TRT, this is actually gonna be like this is gonna be easy to clip because I definitely want to have a natural T booster like section of this podcast. So like
sure. We can talk about a couple other things.
Yeah, like I kind of wanted to like fully parse out the statistics because I hear people talk about the total T increases from these two supplements a lot, but I haven't heard, like you mentioned, the mechanism of action of Tongkat specifically is SHBG reduction potentially.
Okay, that's an important question. On paper, that's the way it's supposed to work. I have not seen massive reductions in SHBG from Indonesian Tongkat Ali.
Because I'm thinking if it was SHBG being lowered, you would not see that. Like the increase in total T does not seem to like line up with that. So I'm thinking, like, this is what I've seen personally. I just put it in the chat. It says hormonally, Tongkat appears to have remarkable anti-estrogenic effects in vitro and has a potency similar to tamoxifen when injected. So that is like the traditional PCT drug for bodybuilders to recover through negative feedback to the HPTA by occupying estrogen receptors, which, interesting, regarding the macular degeneration thing, makes me a little bit weary of the Tongkat, because if it's, again, it seems like there's no manifestation of side effects that would be representative of this, which is good news. And this is like a long-standing supplement. I'm sure somebody would have reported it by now. But like chronic tamoxifen exposure, the main issue is like ocular like degeneration, essentially, like your actual eye just going to shit. So that was my only concern with this compound, but it seems like it does not, like, as far as clarifying the mechanism, because for you, what kind of increases did you see in free T compared to your total T? And then the fact that you saw no changes in your SHBG makes me think it's facilitated more through this comparable to SERMs activity is sort of what I'm thinking.
Yeah, so it was a modest decrease in SHBG, and it was a modest increase in free testosterone, nothing too severe. So I think the mechanism that you're proposing is a very reasonable one. I mean, the first of all, just to be really clear, because of the way that sometimes people hear these things is different than the way that maybe you and I might think they're going to hear them. So, right, this is we're kind of shouting into a tunnel, and then it's being collected on the other end. Yeah. And so, lifestyle, get things right first. That includes not overtraining. Overtraining is a real thing, and by overtraining can be frequency and or duration of workouts. I know that's sort of kind of old news, and people are like, oh yeah, but it's a real thing. Yeah. You know, if you are blasting your adrenals with stimulants and pre-workouts 6 days a week, and you're in there 90 minutes, and you're, you know, doing every set to failure, you unless your androgen backdrop is of a particular level, you're not going to be able to manage that. It's gonna send you dissolving into a puddle of tears at some point. So I think that getting sleep right, et cetera, nutrition, being sufficiently nourished is important. But then, yeah, these supplements are the two that, among the many things that I explored, had effects, and that other people I know got effects from them. Some people don't, and some people get big effects, and some people smaller. So I just want to, emphasize that. The cycles that I've heard of people doing them are anywhere from 12 to 16 weeks, sometimes longer, but then taking 8 weeks off or so, and then just hopping right back on. There's no real rationale for cycling off, to be honest. I think people just sort of do it.
You saw no dips in total T, like when you cycled off? Like
you do. Yeah, okay. when you cycle off, you see that drop, which actually is nice, right? That's a negative control experiment.
Yeah. So do you have like a similar to your, like, how you mention often how with dopamine, if you elevate your state to super physiologic, you can expect a consequent or a subsequent drop below baseline periodically while you kind of reach homeostasis.
when you cycle off this stuff, obviously a lot of people's concern off the bat is, am I going to feel even worse than before I got on it? Like dipping, if I'm literally hypogonadal and I'm getting on a natural T booster that is like rectifying my situation, I would be quite hesitant to cycle off. And I can see how, like, hypothetically, I guess you don't need to cycle off, but I don't know the chronic exposure, potential of this stuff when it comes to, like, I speculate it must act as a SERM for it to have such a significant impact on total T increase with no like significant impact on, like, it's either inhibiting aromatase or acting as a SERM. And it seems like in vitro it is acting as a SERM, and maybe it has some impact on SHBG, but ultimately the total T increase is regulated through the HPTA in some aspect. Maybe the Fadogia somehow has like this interesting, like, pituitary, I don't know, specific effect, but the Tongkat for sure, like, I would be a little bit hesitant to be like, use something that's comparable to Novadex like forever. So during that subsequent like off cycle period, should people expect that they have a dip that feels just like going back to their baseline state prior to the deployment of it? Or do you have, like, because you've exposed your brain to this like new level of androgenic signaling, do you experience like a downswing, or what should people in general expect during that time?
Yeah, it's not that significant a downswing, because it's not that significant an upswing when you are taking it, right? I mean, for most people, right? So, but here's something that I think is really valuable. In any time there's a cycling off, or let's say, and the analogous situation would be someone who's taking a lot of pre-workout that's loaded with tyrosine and alpha GPC and caffeine, and getting the massive stimulation from that, and then they decide, I want this to continue to work, so I'm going to stop taking it for a while. Of course, you're going to feel a dip. What can you do to mitigate that so that you're not dropping way below baseline? Well, the solution in my mind would be, for instance, to continue to train, certainly, but maybe those training sessions are 40 minutes total, 10 minutes of warm up, and then hitting it really, really hard for 40 minutes. So you're sort of offsetting some of the additional stress, and you're sort of pressing on the pedal harder, so to speak, of the androgenic stimulus. Because one thing that's very real, and we have a podcast episode coming out with Duncan French in next month, where his main graduate thesis work was showing what specific types of set rep regimens and total duration training really boost testosterone. Because we all hear that training induces testosterone, big compound movements, but no one's actually really parsed that until he came along.
Right.
And those training regimens are very interesting. Those training regimens involve 10 sets of 10, where you put whatever weight on the bar. These are compound movements to maintain about an 80 to 85% of one repetition maximum, and you're changing the weight from set to set so that you can always get those 10 repetitions. You often need spotters for this because you can't always gauge exactly. With 2 minutes rest in between, brutal. If you've been there, that's intense, right? Yeah. And nothing else that workout, and that's done twice a week. And then they measure serum testosterone, and they get these very impressive increases in serum testosterone, compared to, say, the hour-long typical training session of your people doing your, dips inside, and lateral raises and things of that sort. So when you start to think about training as a androgen stimulus, not just a hypertrophy stimulus, right? Then what I would say is, then you can start to look at that as a behavioral way to offset some of this natural dip that you would expect coming off of anything. Whether or not it's a dopaminergic agent, like whether or not it's a androgenic agent or an indirectly androgenic agent, like in this case, we're viewing Tongkat. So, that 8 weeks also could be a time where, some people are only training in the gym, but some people might do more running, for instance, where it's it's a different type of movement where you don't need to be as, on the gas pedal and gritting your teeth and this sort of thing. So I think that one thing that's often overlooked is the way to modulate training in the on and off cycles of anything. And this is something that people in the old days really understood, because there wasn't this overemphasis on pharmacology. It was a component, but it was more like, how do you train under conditions where you're extremely supported by pharmacology? That was the question then. Then it was, how do you train when you're not supported or you're trying to make it back? Well, when you're trying to make it back to a place when you're not supported, it makes perfect sense that you would train harder and shorter to try and get a naturally occurring stimulus in your system. And I think the problem a lot of people run into is they think either they stop training, or worse, perhaps even, they think, oh, I'm just gonna do everything I have to, stimulants, whatever I have to in order to just train because I want to maintain. And then all you end up doing is sending your system into a catabolic state.
Gotcha.
Yeah. So it involves being, there's a bit of a kind of a push and a pull with these things. And I think that it makes perfect sense that when people are assisted by anything, that they can train more. I mean, that's the reason most athletes who aren't interested in more muscle, why they take performance enhancing drugs. They just want to be able to train more and recover. So
is there, like you mentioned, how you tried a laundry list of other like traditional T boosting supplements? Was there any that you felt were like, some of them are pretty, I guess, more popular than Fadogia and are like regarded to be like relatively efficacious? So things like ashwagandha or something like a boron for SHBG manipulation. Do you see those as having any utility at all, or they're just like so negligible? Not really.
Yeah, I have the most of these. I'm sure you have the lists that are pretty incredible as well.
Yeah.
I mean, if someone, the joke is, if you were to ask me what I take, and we could do I could mention, I take a lot of supplements, but most of them are of the kind of conventional kind, right? Fish oil, some D3, some zinc, grapeseed extract, some ginger, nothing that is going to be particularly surprising. Creatine obviously is a good supplement for raising DHT. Some people are DHT hyper responders to creatine. I know people who truly start losing their hair when they take DHT.
Yeah. Anecdotally, it seems like, despite it, it's not like there's a lot of data to reinforce it, but it does seem like it has interactions with other things too, not just from like a 5-alpha reduction side of things, like myostatin, and I would assume AR content potentially / like sensitivity to androgens in general. But so the laundry list of T boosters, you thought nothing really stood out?
Yeah. So again, this was all in research I thought it'd be fun to have a scientist perspective on some of this. So this is not, now we're talking about personal explorations, just to be clear. I think there were a number of things like D-aspartate.
D-aspartic acid.
Yeah. It did nothing for me whatsoever. There were tribulus. So tribulus was interesting, a very transient, noticeable effect, and then nothing after about 2-3 days. Just didn't make much of an impact. There is a pretty significant effect of, I'm almost reluctant to say it because I don't recommend it, but bulbine natalensis will definitely increase the numbers, but there does appear to be some pretty serious issues around potential Leydig cell toxicity. So I think these are, now I'm sure there are people out there who know sources or ways of doing this that are different, but that one was pretty remarkable. But I wouldn't recommend it because it seemed like the toxicity issue has been demonstrated in rodents and perhaps in humans as well. Are you familiar with it?
No, but I know some of the scrutiny on Fadogia has been somewhat close to that. Like, it sounded like it wasn't in humans that this happened, but it was like something to do with I don't know, testicular toxicity in some aspect, or like speculated. I don't know if that's like similar though, or has any overlap whatsoever, because that was again, like, no one even really knows how it works, let alone if it's going to cause any side effects, and doesn't seem to be.
Bulbine has some known toxicity at high doses. I think the data on
adverse effects on both kidney and livers. I think bulbine is potentially hazardous. So those were I think that grabs the important parameters. It was around as I mentioned, January this year, then that I started saying, okay, well, is there anything out there that I should test for this, and keeping my numbers, and
a regimented exploration for sake of this, potentially a book or a podcast. I was doing it for my own curiosity too. I should say none of these things led to increases that were so significant that they allowed for a complete overhaul of training, for instance, like where you could train much more and recover, or massive increases in libido or anything maybe subtle. But I will say I'd done the work to make sure that my levels were good going in, and I would say I'd done the work. I was feeling pretty good to begin with.
Yeah.
I wasn't suffering any specific clinical symptoms or anything of that sort.
Okay. So what you were doing is representative of what it can actually do, because your lifestyle factors, diet, et cetera, are all kind of like dialed in to begin with. So that's obviously
right.
notable.
And I think that the reason I've mentioned it recently on podcasts and so forth is that, I think that there ought to be some consideration of things between doing nothing. Obviously, there's doing nothing, there's behavioral optimization, lifestyle optimization, there's supplementation, and then there's, let's say, because it's the right way to do it, is, working with physician and prescription TRT.
So obviously a lot to unpack there. And, my interest was getting piqued as our conversation unfolded, and, hearing these crazy before and afters of individuals with low T, experiencing pushes into normal or high normal physiologic range. For me, it was like quite interesting because, I'm somebody who, like he said, I should also put a disclaimer. He mentions something between, nothing and TRT. He thinks that there should be steps of like essentially before you get to TRT, which I totally agree with. And I always talk about on my channel is don't haphazardly get on hormones, especially if they are a lifelong commitment. Something as intense as TRT is not something to just haphazardly jump on because you had a transient like fucking 300 nanogram per deciliter total. Like this is something to try and dial in and optimized through lifestyle, dietary interventions, following a proper circadian rhythm, blocking blue light at night, like so many obvious kind of like low-hanging fruit things that go overlooked, vitamin D status, stuff like that. And then above and beyond that, supplementation. Is it worth going to between, that optimization period and TRT? Well, that for me, previously I had thought, okay, things like vitamin D status, zinc, magnesium, boron maybe, but I didn't really know about these things that actually manipulated the HPTA or directly acted on lighting cells like HCG does. Very odd, like this Fadogia shit. Very, very unique and strange to me. And hearing these, like this worthwhile, endeavor where he was doing these experiments on himself to see if he could optimize his testosterone levels, and then working with, military and like working with like a lot of like high tier individuals who are looking to optimize without going the PED route and all this stuff. And obviously owning Merrick Health and dealing with people who are trying to optimize their hormone panels on a consistent basis. I'm just like, like obviously something that's an in-between between optimization and like going full-blown TRT, like obviously I'm interested. So without getting on too much of a tangent, like this obviously piqued my interest highly. You saw me really, dig into the mechanism of action, potential side effect profile, which things work versus don't do anything with Huberman during the podcast. Again, like I said, go check out that podcast if you haven't. And as far back as his first his Rogan appearance where he talked about this stuff and, its potential applications and people who are, low T and are looking to get back into physiologic range or like mid, physiologic range to high end in some cases, who are good responders and individuals who are just looking to optimize without going the full-blown testosterone replacement route. Obviously, a situation and context that I am like highly interested in, especially for even patients at Merrick Health, potentially individuals that may benefit from something like this before they go the full-blown replacement route. And again, I was very skeptical of a lot of this shit, but it seemed like there was a couple of things of a sea of like bullshit ingredients that did nothing that might actually work. So we're gonna dig into the actual mechanism of that stuff now. You heard him briefly talk about it, but I'm gonna dig into the actual studies as well now and kind of break down like what is in this thing and why did I choose the things we did ultimately in this product. So the breakdown of Sigma, let's get into it. So first off, we have In a 4 capsule serving size, we have magnesium as magnesium bisglycinate, also known as glycinate. It's the exact same thing. Zinc as zinc bisglycinate, glycinate. Vitamin D3, Fadogia Agrestis, Tongkat Ali, specifically sourced from Indonesia, ashwagandha, and boron. And the dosage breakdown being 200 milligrams of magnesium, 30 milligrams zinc, 75 micrograms of vitamin D3, 600 milligrams of Fadogia Agrestis, 400 milligrams Tongkat Ali, ashwagandha at 300, and boron at 6. And ultimately, for me, this product is like the fucking, like this is how big it is. This is my head, and this is how big the bottle is. It's 240 capsules, and as much as I could have loaded up this product, if there was any way to load it anymore, it would have exceeded a bottle size that could otherwise house capsules. And there was literally no more room to fit anything else. But I think that like some of these, yields for the, like elemental components. So we have like magnesium as bisglycinate, zinc as zinc bisglycinate. These things, the weight of them is so much significantly more than what you see on the label, because you have the actual yield of the elemental magnesium, the elemental zinc, blah, blah, blah. When in reality, you have like 5x the amount in the actual capsules to yield that elemental amount you see on the bottle. So just keep that in mind if you're wondering, like, why would you not like put it in more magnesium? It's like you can only fit so much in a 4 capsule serving size, as well as in a bottle that's 240 capsules already. So like anything above this, we're getting to like pre-workout, like powder scooping territory, which I didn't see as viable. So I just didn't go that route. So this is like the biggest, most maxed out we could possibly get. And I'm very happy with how it came out. I think it's very balanced. I don't think it's too aggressive in anything, because again, these are things you don't want to overdo, especially Fadogia, which we're going to get into shortly. And you heard me express my concerns of the, testicular toxicity, rodent data, as well as even with like some of these, minerals and shit. You don't want to be overdoing anything. Same thing with the Tongkat. Even something as benign as ashwagandha, like it's seen as like this, anti-cortisol, anti-stress compound that's good for relaxing. And yeah, it's great at what it does. But again, like even ashwagandha, like personally, anecdotally, I've seen like side effects in that in humans as well. Like although it does have more literature to support it than something like Fadogia, you do see acute spikes in liver toxicity if you use it chronically at too high of a dose. So these are things, even the most benign of things, seemingly, that are more popularized, you got to be careful of. So I was very mindful of keeping it balanced and not too aggressive in any one vector when creating this product. So anyways, getting into the breakdown of each ingredient specifically, because it's kind of like what I'm known for on this channel. Gorilla Mode has like an hour and 10-minute breakdown, Nitric an hour and a half. Like these products need to be broken down elaborately for everyone to see the data, understand it, and actually get a grasp of what they are putting in their body before they do it. So like obviously I would want to see this before I bought something like this, especially if it's going to be manipulating my testosterone profile significantly and work on my HPTA and stimulate Leydig cells like directly, testicles like increasing in size. Like this is shit you need to understand beforehand. So getting into it, first, not only are we going to talk about the mechanism of action, how this stuff works, but we're also going to be talking about the formats. So bioavailability of magnesium bisglycinate, or diglycinate. This is another word for, if you've seen bisglycinate, glycinate, diglycinate, like these are all essentially different words for the same shit. So when you see magnesium diglycinate, glycinate, we're talking about bisglycinate. So don't get confused by that, because I was actually confused about it too before I really dug into this stuff. And as far as its comparison with magnesium oxide in patients with ileal resection. So why we're looking at this is because we want to know how absorbable this stuff is to begin with too. So not only are you choosing the dosages that need to work, but in addition, you have to make sure they are tolerable on your GI. They're going to be bioavailable. So when I'm choosing a magnesium format, I'm thinking what is the ideal, most optimal way to deliver this stuff to? And I found that to be bisglycinate format. That seems to be, a lot of people are deficient in glycine, especially when trying to balance out excessive methionine intake in their diets. It can be healthy to get, this glycine content in. And in addition to that, it seems to be more bioavailable. So here, data from this study support the suggestion that some portion of magnesium diglycinate is absorbed intact, probably via dipeptide transport pathway. Magnesium diglycinate may be a good alternative to commonly used magnesium supplements in patients with intestinal resections. So this is a population that are at risk for developing magnesium depletion deficiency because of poor absorption, decreased intake, as well as endogenous losses. So obviously they're like the hyper extreme example of inability to absorb magnesium from actual predispositions. But these individuals, even that, you know, disglycinate or diglycinate, also known as bisglycinate and glycinate, are superior to magnesium oxide, and other formats of magnesium are more distressing of your gastrointestinal system and aren't as bioavailable ultimately. And the same thing applies for zinc. Here we have a comparison of two oral formulations comparing zinc bisglycinate, also known as diglycinate, also known as glycinate, versus zinc gluconate after a single administration. And here at the end, we found that bisglycinate administration was safe and well tolerated, and the bisglycinate significantly increased the oral bioavailability of zinc, 43.4% compared with the gluconate. So again, the format chosen for our magnesium and zinc is bisglycinate, also known as glycinate, at the dosages chosen of 200 milligrams of magnesium bisglycinate and zinc as 30 milligrams of zinc bisglycinate. And we've also divided the dosages into a 2 and 4 capsule dosage. So we actually have a halved amount for individuals who don't want to be exposed to the full concentration of these ingredients. Specifically, this is to be mindful of the Fadogia and Tongkat and Ashwagandha intake mainly. It's not as concerning for the magnesium, zinc, D3, and boron, but just wanted to mention that. So now getting into the actual efficacy measures when it comes to magnesium supplementation. Is this something that has a significant effect on testosterone levels? This is a study called Effects of Magnesium Supplementation on Testosterone Levels of Athletes and Sedentary Subjects at Rest and After Exhaustion. Basically what they found for individuals who are supplementing with 10 milligrams magnesium per kilogram of body weight versus those who were doing actual exercise with that same dosage of 10 milligrams magnesium per kilogram of body weight versus individuals that are taking no supplements. Free plasma testosterone levels increased at exhaustion before and after supplementation compared to resting levels. Exercise also increased testosterone levels relative to sedentary subjects. Similar increases were observed for total T. Our results show that supplementation of magnesium increases free and total testosterone values in sedentary and in athletes. The increases are higher in those who exercise than in sedentary individuals. So is magnesium going to spike your level to super physiological territory? No, but it is ultimately and I can like manipulate the fuck out of interpreting the study to make it seem like it's testosterone boosting as hell. But ultimately what you need to know is if you're deficient in basic nutrients and minerals, you are not going to produce testosterone optimally. And the main actual utility of magnesium in a supplement like this is to hit backfill deficiencies and things that you're not going to be getting through your diet. I don't know really anyone that is not checking their shit through chronometer that actually gets an adequate magnesium intake in on a regular basis. So I say like average individuals, obviously people who are like super on top of their shit and dial everything in, maybe, but even still, like I take a magnesium supplement personally on my own before bed. I take magnesium bisglycinate for the same reasons I just discussed. And I feel like most people typically benefit from magnesium. So again, if you're an individual pursuing, you know, natural testosterone boosting, having it featured in your testosterone boosting product formula would be prudent in my opinion. And it is absolutely useful. And it is just a health supporting ingredient in general because most people are not getting enough. Moving into the correlation between serum test levels and concentrations of copper and zinc in hair tissue. This was used to assess zinc levels and its influence on testosterone synthesis. Subjects with normal test levels had a significantly higher zinc level compared to low testosterone level group, which had lower zinc concentrations. Significant negative correlations were evident between total testosterone and copper levels, as well as the copper to zinc ratio. Normal testosterone is associated with a higher zinc level. So again, something that if you're deficient in, you're going to not produce as much testosterone. And again, even androgen receptor expression and sensitivity, things like this are impaired when you don't have adequate zinc. So is this something that's going to boost your testosterone some crazy amount? If you're deficient, yeah, it might be highly useful. But again, this is something that some people are deficient in, may otherwise benefit from supplementing with. But again, magnesium, zinc obviously easier, get through your diet. Magnesium, most people are still gonna be deficient even when they're trying, to be honest. But zinc, a no-brainer to include in this product because of how potent of an effect it has on testosterone levels. Another study here, zinc status and serum testosterone levels in healthy adults. Basically, they find zinc supplementation of marginally zinc deficient normal elderly men for 6 months resulted in an increase in serum testosterone from 8.3 to 16 nanomoles per liter. We conclude that zinc may play an important role in modulating serum testosterone levels in normal men. Obviously notable, associations of urinary metal concentrations and circulating testosterone levels in Chinese men. Significant dose-response relationships were found between decreased testosterone, urinary manganese, and zinc, even when considering multiple metals. Our results indicate that elevated manganese and zinc are inversely associated with testosterone production. So ultimately they are looking at the actual urinary output and like retaining of minerals and the effect it has on testosterone status. And ultimately, you know, we see the same kind of thing over and over again, which is that having adequate mineral intake, nutrient intake, obviously critical for supporting healthy testosterone levels. I think most of us know that by now. Getting into vitamin D status. So this is something that, you know, due to the predominantly indoor lifestyle humans have adapted to over the years, most people aren't getting enough vitamin D. And many still don't get enough, even when they're exposed to the sun. Like for me, this was on 8,000 IU of vitamin D3 per day. That's what it required me to get up to 66.6 nanograms per milliliter. And when my intake was, I don't know, like 3,000 to 4,000 per day, I had like a 36 or something like that. So, and like admittedly, I probably don't get out in the sun enough. But again, this isn't like a band-aid necessarily. You should be still exposing yourself to the sun, you know, getting up, you know, going out, exposing yourself to some sunlight, getting the rays in your eyes, you know, going for walks, shit like that. But if you get your bloods done and your vitamin D 25 hydroxy is low and you are otherwise deficient in vitamin D, this will affect AR content, this will affect AR expression, this will affect your actual testosterone levels themselves, and we see individuals have a pretty significant uptick in testosterone production when they actually take adequate amounts of vitamin D in order to have the support to actually produce those hormone levels to begin with. Because ultimately vitamin D is not just like a supplement or nutrient necessarily or a vitamin. It is also a literal like steroid. It's like hormonal in its like structure essentially. And it's not just for, like I said, optimizing testosterone production, but also for the AR itself. So vitamin D is expressed in reproductive tissues, including prostate, testes, and human sperm. And vitamin D receptor knockout mice actually have gonadal insufficiency, suggesting a role for vitamin D in reproductive function. This is another notable study, testicular synthesis and vitamin D action. Here they found that human primary testicular cell culture model suggested that vitamin D plays a major role in male steroidogenesis. So this is, you know, the actual process of taking cholesterol and, you know, cleaving it down to testosterone, having, you know, pregnenolone breaking down into all of these, you know, side hormones that you probably are less familiar with, but things like, you know, allopregnenolone, most notable from, you know, post-finasteride syndrome research. Downstream, you have things like DHEA production, androstenedione, testosterone, aromatization to estradiol. Like this whole process of breaking down cholesterol and converting it into all these different sex steroids is steroidogenesis, and it derives up at the top from the backbone of cholesterol itself. And this is a function that is facilitated partly through having adequate vitamin D status. In addition to that, effective vitamin D supplementation on testosterone levels in men. I believe this is the big study, or there was one more actually. It was, there's two things I wanted to get into here, which are vitamin D. I think you guys kind of get the point, but ultimately we have here, our study suggests that vitamin D supplementation might increase testosterone levels in men. Further randomized controlled trials are needed to confirm this hypothesis and evaluate whether vitamin D driven increase in testosterone contribute to the vitamin D effects on various health outcomes. But here they had a human population. They basically looked at the assessment of before and after concentrations of total T and found, you know, minor increases, but notable nonetheless. And ultimately you're going to be, you know, cognizant of the fact that vitamin D is going to be impactful on your ability to actually regulate steroidogenesis, which downstream is going to lead to testosterone and AR expressed functions in the body ultimately. But the big study, this was the association of vitamin D status with serum androgen levels in men. Here they used, let's see, in cross-sectional study, vitamin D, testosterone, and SHBG levels were assessed by immunoassay in 2,299 men who were routinely referred for coronary angiography. Main outcome measures were associations of vitamin D with testosterone, sex hormone binding globulin, and free androgen index. So if you don't know what that is, it's basically a way of assessing your like ratio of bioavailable androgens relative to, you know, the binding proteins in your total T levels and whatnot. And basically at the end of this big study, they found that we have presented evidence for an association of vitamin D levels with androgens in a large cohort of older men. This notion is further supported by similar seasonal variations of vitamin D and serum androgen levels. We suggest that these results may provide rationale for randomized controlled trials evaluating the impact of vitamin D supplementation on testosterone levels per se and hypogonadism associated adverse health consequences. So vitamin D, obviously very important. I think a lot of people know, but a lot of people are still deficient in it. So it's definitely worth checking your vitamin D status through blood work and assessing if it is adequate. And this is why we have, again, 200 milligrams of magnesium bisglycinate, 30 milligrams of zinc bisglycinate, and 75 micrograms, also known as 3,000 IUs of vitamin D3. And again, that amount is a safe amount. You might need more, you might need less, but that is an amount that I thought was a middle ground for a lot of people to get kind of like a support from that may be deficient, but that's how you assess it. It's through your blood work would be ideal. So definitely get that checked out to assess your status. Like again, I mentioned this was mine, vitamin D 25 hydroxy at 66.6 nanograms per milliliter. You know, you don't want to be at, you know, fucking 100, doesn't necessarily mean better, but you don't want to be, you know, suboptimal or subclinical or on the low end of the spectrum, because this is going to have some correlation to androgen receptors, as well as steroidogenesis itself. So this is a separate clip I recorded after the first video. It was like, you know, a 2+ hour breakdown video, and there was some stuff that I skimmed over that I felt like was worth revisiting to be more comprehensive, because I came across a bit more literature that I wanted to add to the vitamin D section as well as the Fadogia section. This is why it looks probably slightly different than the last than the video you were just watching, and then it's probably going to clip into the existing video again. But anyways, the vitamin D section, I wanted to cover dietary intake quickly too, because I don't want to imply that supplementation is the only thing you can do other than, you know, getting adequate sun exposure and whatnot. Because again, obviously getting out, getting light in your eyes, getting outside, you know, very, very good, as well as, you know, supplementation can be quite useful, like I've shown in, you know, the previous studies, as well as, you know, blood work metrics and whatnot. But getting vitamin D through diet, I don't think a lot of people realize that there are vitamin D dense sources of food. So it would obviously be prudent to have a comprehensive diet that hits your dietary needs for different vitamins and minerals and nutrients and whatnot in order to support overall physiologic functions, health, vitality, etc. So I just wanted to make this quick little breakdown of vitamin D highest containing foods in case you guys weren't aware. So cod liver oil has the highest concentration of vitamin D at 1360, so 1,360 international units. Trout has the second most, salmon, mushrooms, milk, soy, almond, and oat milks. Obviously some of these like fortified cereals I would not really recommend as much. But some things like eggs, you know, obviously large egg, you know, super nutrient dense. Liver, nature's multivitamin, has a significant amount of vitamin A, copper, vitamin D even. Like it is like the most broad spectrum thing you could be adding into your diet, and I highly recommend almost everyone add an ounce per day into their daily diet. That's what I do personally, and I think it has been a game changer for hitting certain nutrient needs and whatnot. And this is kind of like a descending list of, you know, concentrations for vitamin D, but just in case you guys weren't aware that you can, you know, get vitamin D through your diet too, this is a worthwhile list to defer to. Now moving on to the more exotic compounds in this formula, we have, you know, the Fadogia Agrestis, probably the most hyped up one. We have Tongkat Ali, we have Ashwagandha, and we're gonna be digging into the Fadogia data right now, which is the compound that seems to have the biggest needle moving potential when it comes to total testosterone increases, at least in conjunction with Tongkat Ali. We heard Huberman mention on Joe Rogan that Tongkat will increase testosterone by upwards of 100 to 200 nanograms per deciliter, but when used in conjunction with Fadogia Agrestis, you've seen, anecdotally, there's been numerous cases of 300, 400 nanogram per deciliter total increases, and some individuals on the low end who have low test, you know, like 200-ish range, could end up anywhere from like 700 plus, like close to, I don't know, like mid 700. So we're looking at like 500 nanogram per deciliter total testosterone increase, which is fucking massive. So obviously this stuff, you know, highly interested me and also concerned me at the same time, because there is a certain amount of literature that talks about its toxicity. You know, there is, for just the amount of studies that have, you know, showing massive increases in total test. On the opposite side of the spectrum, there are data using the exact same dosages that show toxicity outcomes in an escalating manner. So at the lowest dosage burden, we see relatively benign outcomes from a toxicity context, and from an efficacy context, we only see twofold increases in total test levels, which is, you know, only, it's a fucking shit ton still. But at the high end of the spectrum, we had 6-fold total testosterone increases, which is like mind-boggling numbers. So obviously this stuff got a lot of hype from, you know, these rodents that would end up just like wanting to fuck the shit out of each other. Their mounting frequency would go way up, you know, their total testosterone levels go through the roof. But this toxicity data, you know, obviously concerning, and it kind of, for me, when I sort of was writing off test booster ingredients entirely, I was like, okay, look, like Tongkat acts as a SERM, which we soon find out is not the only mechanism of action, although potentially one of the primary ones. And then Fadogia, I'm like, why is it showing testicular toxicity? And like, obviously, you know, that's fucking concerning and kind of sketchy. Like, why is it doing it? What is going on? And, you know, write it off entirely. You know, that's what I thought initially too. But Huberman sort of, you know, encouraged me through his copious amounts of content and his literature reviews and whatnot to kind of dig into it further. And he was actually an instrumental part in getting this product out and, you know, auditing it and, you know, helping me in, you know, decide what dosage increments to use. Because ultimately the Fadogia dose in this is chosen for a very specific reason. So at the 4 capsule dose, we have 600 milligrams. At the 2 capsule dose, we have 300 milligrams. So it goes up in 150 milligram increments per capsule. So 150 at 1, 300 milligrams at 2 capsules, 450 milligrams at 3, 600 milligrams at 4. And what I saw when I was first learning about this stuff and he was talking about it and there wasn't really anybody, you know, manufacturing it, producing it or anything, is that companies were basically forcing you to take 1 capsule of 600 milligrams or 1 capsule of 500 milligrams. And it was like, you're basically forced to take 600 Fadogia, 400 Tongkat, and there was no like entry level, you know, newbie dose where you could get a more, I don't know, careful assessment and titration of exposure. Rather, you were forced to like a high-end dose that potentially in a long-term scenario may otherwise lead to, you know, toxicity outcomes in some individuals. And again, to be mindful of this, ashwagandha and other things like this that actually have like a lot of literature to support its efficacy have shown like increases in liver enzymes and whatnot and some toxicity outcomes with chronic exposure at high enough doses for long enough durations of time. So this is something to be mindful of, even from the more like benign and like more well accepted in the literature compounds. Like this stuff all has like a Goldilocks zone, and at some point you are going to enter toxic territory, which we're going to get into what exactly that is, what's going on, the mechanism of action of this stuff. Because again, the mechanism is also kind of unclear. You know, the kind of LH mimic is, you know, what I first heard on the Joe Rogan episode that Huberman was on. And then later we talked about it, and it was apparently an upregulation in LH production at the pituitary level. And other people have talked about it as an LH mimic. Other people have talked about it somehow improving like the actual Leydig cell stimulation via LH receptor complex, you know, upregulation essentially, where you have the same receptor that gets hit and activated by LH as well as human chorionic gonadotropin HCG, which is an LH mimic itself. You know, the stimulation of that and the upregulation of testosterone production into intratesticularly, it was kind of like, what the fuck is this thing doing? And like, how is it skipping the feedback loop was the main thing I wanted to know, because I'm very familiar with aromatase inhibition, selective estrogen receptor modulation, these things that manipulate, or anti-androgens, things that manipulate either androgen receptor activation or estrogen receptor activation and kind of prevent feedback to the hypothalamus. Because as you guys may or may not know, if you follow my channel, you probably are at least somewhat familiar with the hypothalamus pituitary testicular axis, which is basically how your body regulates how much testosterone to produce. So basically you have the hypothalamus, which then produces GnRH, gonadotropin releasing hormone, which is responsive to feedback systems essentially. So this feedback loop, if you have adequate testosterone, androgen receptors being activated essentially, and downstream aromatization to estradiol, estrogen receptor activation in target tissues in the body, you get like an actual feedback to your brain that says we have adequate amounts of these hormones, we don't need to produce more. So as a result, the hypothalamus won't produce as much gonadotropin releasing hormone, and the lowered production of that leads to less stimulation of luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone in the pituitary, which then results in less actual stimulation and signaling to your testes to produce sperm and intratesticular testosterone. So that feedback system can be manipulated through things like aromatase inhibitors, SERMs, etc. Things like Novadex, Clomid, Aromacin, Arimidex, you know, Letrozole. I'm sure you've heard of all these compounds in the bodybuilding world that have been manipulated either for inhibiting estrogen production, estrogen signaling, helping in a PCT context, like a lot of this stuff. And then HCG, it is not working through this feedback system. It's going right to the Leydig cells, acting as LH. And that in itself suppresses GnRH production, which suppresses LH and FSH too. So this Fadogia stuff supposedly was not inhibiting the production of LH or FSH, and in some cases raising it, raising the LH specifically significantly. And I'm just like, that's what I mentioned in the Huberman podcast. I'm like, have we seen any before and afters of GnRH levels? Like, what is going on exactly? It's speculative, which we're going to get into the literature and what I think is actually going on, because it was kind of unclear. And even like while digging into literature, I found contradicting things. And that's, partially why I'm adding this add-on clip after, because I want to have a like full spectrum of information to kind of allow you to make your own conclusion and assess all of the literature available. So again, the dosage breakdown, like I mentioned, it's only 150 per capsule, so you can actually titrate accordingly and go to an entry-level dose where you get the minimum effective dose with no side effect burden, ideally. And then you can also cycle off accordingly based on the cycling parameters that I outlined on the bottle. And, Huberman, mentioned the cycling parameters that he used. He used this stuff for quite a while without cycling off. He was a lot less, I think there was a lot less data around this shit too. Like not very many anecdotes when he was experimenting. So he used it for a while and he was, side effect free seemingly. And for us, we have a more conservative approach, which is every month taking 1 week off of the product, which I think is very conservative, because when we actually get into this literature, we see what the exposure was like in the toxicity data, as well as the efficacy data, and we get a more clear picture of like what actually makes sense. So the actual dosage breakdown where we saw efficacy is in mouse and rodent models, which is where all the hype came from, these massive like 6-fold increases in total test, which, obviously in humans, not the humans, we see anecdotes of very, very big spikes in total T2, which, and then, getting on Rogan and all this shit, the hype train kind of like snowballed a bit. So here we see the rodent studies going up to 100 milligrams per kilogram, where we see the most increases in total T, mounting frequency, but we also see the most testicular toxicity, which we'll get into shortly. So this leads to an estimated human dose of 550 milligrams to 1100 milligrams for a 150 pound person, 700 milligrams to 1450 milligrams for a 200 pound person, 900 milligrams to 1800 milligrams for a 250 pound person. So again, these dosage increments for us, when I'm formulating this thing, I'm kind of looking at, okay, in unison with all other compounds that have their own inherent mechanism of action, have their own testosterone boosting capabilities through either anti-stress cortisol type effects, through minor SERM activity, or modulation of SHBG, or other different things that kind of cumulatively lead to a more compounded, like efficacious effect overall. What is the minimum efficacious dose, and like where is that more responsible entry point? So that's why our max efficacious dose is like the bottom end of the range here. And from there, you titrate up from something that is more manageable and has a more, tolerable entry point, and is, based on actual, like the literature in rodents is obviously like very, very cool to see, but also fucking sketchy at the same time. So you have to be mindful of these things and weigh the ROI very carefully yourself before you jump into this stuff. And you have to be very cognizant too of checking your data as you go. Because again, this sort of thing, assessing actual efficacy outcomes, is not hard to do. When you look at your biomarkers, you can see metrics of total T, metrics of LH and FSH, also checking your actual semen parameters and checking sperm counts, motility, morphology, etc. These are things you should be staying on top of if you want to take this seriously, because ultimately this is a product meant to be a foundational backbone for hormone optimization. It's not meant to be, something that you like just haphazardly jump on. This is something that could be a potential in-between for individuals who have done the lifestyle modifications, perfected their diet, have perfect sleep hygiene, get their sleep in, blah, blah, blah. And then even then, at that point, if they still haven't got to where they need to get to for optimal outcomes from a performance, vitality, sexual health standpoint, whatever it is, instead of jumping on TRT, which is a lifelong commitment where you are basically committing to shutting down your ball sack, that, very, very significant commitment. Now, again, obviously there's ways to offset that potentially with HCG administration long-term. Then you get into, do you want to maintain your HBTA too? There are a lot of things to consider, but ultimately the lifelong adherence to TRT, you're on it for life essentially when you get on it. Like, this is not something you want to just jump into willy-nilly So if there's something in between that is orally bioavailable and works very well through minor manipulation of, the expression of the LH receptor complex, if you have minor manipulation of pituitary output of LH, if you have Leydig cells responding more favorably, you have minor SERM modulation where you have not a significant enough inhibition of estrogen receptor activation, but just enough where you get some level of uptick in GnRH and subsequent to that LH and FSH with no actual notable side effect profile. You would see this in your actual parameters, which is what I would highly encourage you guys to do. And I think Huberman mentioned it in the long clip I had at the start of our conversation, where these are things to stay on top of and be mindful of, because again, this is not something that could be side effect free at all dosage amounts for all durations of time. You should be cycling, you should be using a minimum efficacious dose and following your biomarkers. So anyways, these dosage increments, I thought that was the reasonable point where we're hitting efficacy while being mindful of the data that's showing negative outcomes in rodents. So the first study that gets the most hype is this study on aphrodisiac potentials of the aqueous extract of Fadogia agrestis stem in male albino rats. So what they wanted to do was evaluate the phytochemical constituents and the aphrodisiac potential of Fadogia agrestis in male albino rats. The dosages used were oral administration of 18 milligrams per kilogram, 50 milligrams per kilogram, and 100 milligrams per kilogram, respectively, at 24-hour intervals, and sexual behavior parameters and serum testosterone concentrations were evaluated at days 1, 3, and 5. So what they found in here is the actual breakdown of what was found in the Fadogia agrestis for alkaloid content, saponins content, tannins, phlebotoins, phenolics, flavonoids, etc. Getting to the male sexual behavior, what they found was significant increase in sexual vigor and all these different metrics of, mount frequency, intromission, frequency, intromission, latency. Let's see, we have here mount latency, ejaculatory latency, and we see basically dose-dependent improvements in all of these metrics in a very, very, very favorable way. And then getting down to the most hyped up chart of it all, the effect of administration of Fadogia agrestis on the serum testosterone concentrations, bars carrying letters different from the controls on each day, days 1, 3, and 5, significantly different. So basically you see here, the control group, day 1, 3, and 5, almost no difference in their total testosterone levels. For 18 milligram per kilogram, we see this giant jump here. And this actually represents a 2-fold increase in total testosterone levels. At the 50 milligram per kilogram dose, we see a 3-fold increase in total testosterone levels. And then at 100 milligrams per kilogram, we see a 6-fold increase in total testosterone levels here. Various doses, 18, 50, and 100 produce 2, 3, and 6-fold increases compared with control by the end of the experimental period. So obviously, this does not seem to have a low ceiling. This seemed to be something that in a dose-dependent manner really spiked shit into the stratosphere. 6-fold increases from control. Pretty significant. Pretty fucking significant is the least, I don't know, it's underselling it, but it's very, very dramatic and obviously, caught the attention of many people, myself included. So at this 18 milligram dose, 50 milligram, and 100 milligram, there is varying levels of toxicity they find too. But first of all, the pros, before we get to the cons, this is the main thing most of us are concerned with, is how much of an impact does it have here? And they basically found that it has provided scientific evidence as to its purported aphrodisiac effect. Fadogia agrestis may be adduced to increase the testosterone level in the blood, which may be due to its saponin content. So they basically find that the saponin content of this compound can seemingly upregulate the production of luteinizing hormone at the pituitary level without actually causing any negative feedback inhibition. So when we think of things like tamoxifen, I don't know, N-clomiphene, what's a better example? Raloxifene. There are different SERMs that have different varying levels of agonist and antagonist activity at different receptor sites, but I don't know, tamoxifen, probably the one you're most familiar with, Novadex in a post-psychotherapy context. This is also used for attenuating gyno progression, and it is something that is used in a potent pro-fertility context because of its negative feedback inhibition. So when you occupy estrogen receptors and you're preventing estrogen from actually binding and causing RNA transcription at the receptor site, you are basically preventing that feedback, which then tells your brain there's adequate amount of estrogen present, which then tells your brain like, oh, we need to make more testosterone to aromatize into more estrogen because we don't have enough to achieve the adequate amount of receptor activation we need in, like fill in the blank tissue in the body. So that is where you then get an uptick in GnRH production, which leads to LH and FSH going up, which then leads to testosterone levels getting increased in the testicles. So with this stuff though, it does not seem to have any sort of like occupying of estrogen receptors or some clinically significant amount of estrogen receptor signaling inhibition. It's kind of odd, like there is no real indication of its interactions with this feedback system. It seems to have some sort of stimulation at the pituitary level and upregulate how much LH is spit out, and clinically significant at that. We see up to super physiologic levels of LH, seemingly on human blood work too. It's really, really crazy what this shit might be able to do. And downstream at the actual testicular level, we see interesting interactions seemingly with the actual Leydig cell stimulation. This study here was assessing a different species of Fadogia and alkaloid content and saponin contents and whatnot, and they found here the alkaloid fraction of the seeds of Hygrophila spinosa reportedly increased testosterone production by Leydig cells in vitro, an increased amount in intromission frequency in male rats. Let's see, ercoline, which is an alkaloid derived from the betel nut, has also been shown to increase testosterone secretion by the Leydig cells in rats. So there is some speculated LH, like HCG, whatever, like the actual receptor complex itself. It's called the luteinizing hormone choriogonadotropin receptor, which is what interacts directly with LH for Leydig cell stimulation, as well as HCG2, which is again not bioidentical but a mimic of LH, which some have speculated may be how Fadogia also works. Does it have direct impact on the stimulation of Leydig cells, bypassing the need for pituitary output of LH? I don't know. Potentially. It's kind of odd, and it seems to have some overlap with perhaps multiple different mechanisms of action here, but the most notable, in my opinion, seemingly is the increase in LH output itself, but there may be some regulation of actual testicular steroid and cholesterol homeostasis as well, because it seems like intratesticular cholesterol levels are also increased in a dose-dependent manner with Fadogia agrestis. So as far as like actual steroidogenesis intratesticularly, there is like a big cascade of events that happens. It's not just LH, binds and then, stimulates Leydig cells and boom, testosterone is made. And at a base level, we kind of know, LH and FSH go down to the gonads, produce sperm, testosterone, blah, blah, blah. But like what actually happens after LH binds to the luteinizing hormone chorionic gonadotropin receptor and stimulates Leydig cell production, output of testosterone. It seems like there is like different involvement in enzymatic functions and processes that may be impacted in some capacity by Fadogia constituents. It's unclear, it's just anecdotal and hypothetical ultimately, but this increase in cholesterol content in the testicles, where we see like increase in the substrate available for steroidogenic acute regulatory protein and some of these like kind of like cyclic AMP dependent processes that ultimately lead to cholesterol biosynthesis and downstream the cleaving and like integration of this in order to actually create, sex hormones. This actual involvement, is it change with Fadogia integration? Like it seems interesting because when we see HCG administration deplete cholesterol content, we see a spike and then a quick, sharp, acute drop after, because it's literally recruiting and literally using up the reserve cholesterol in order to fuel steroidogenesis. Whereas for Fadogia, we see like this dose-dependent increase in cholesterol content and the simultaneous LH increase from the pituitary, and then potentially at the LH chorionic gonadotropin receptor complex level, we see potentially increased Leydig cell upregulation or expression in response to actual activation, which then leads to the increased biosynthesis of cholesterol intratesticularly, which then produces more substrate to actually make use of and produce more testosterone? Or is it just a response to the heightened LH output and there's no direct interaction? It's kind of interesting because when you think of it at an LH mimic level, if Fadogia was indeed doing that in some capacity, you would think, okay, it's acting directly on Leydig cells and recruiting this same kind of process that HCG does. So there's potentially, some level of that happening. although it's, I would say, relatively unlikely that there's like orally bioavailable HCG essentially in a pill, but the LH output by the pituitary and some sort of interaction at the receptor expression level seems to be the two ways by which this mediates most of its effects. And we see this kind of represented in the pituitary output, in addition to the actual cholesterol content escalating in dose-dependent manner and the subsequent increases in testosterone in a dose-dependent manner too, as well as the testicular toxicity. It seemingly actually lines up with this perfectly, which we're going to get into now, which is the actual toxicity data on this stuff, which seems to have the most concern. So again, the 18 milligram per kilogram dose, 50 milligram per kilogram dose, and 100 milligram per kilogram dose were assessed for efficacy, and they found very, very promising data in the rodents. But then they obviously wanted to assess their toxicity concerns, because this is something that could be useful in humans. And we want to know, like, is there safety around it? You know, is it going to be well tolerated? So they used the exact same dosages, and this was for 28 days. So they had rats were grouped into 4, A, B, C, and D, where A, control, received orally 1 milliliter distilled water. B, C, and D groups received either 18 milligrams, 50 milligrams per kilogram, or 100 milligrams per kilogram of Fadogia for 28 days. So what they found after 28 days was increased in percentage testes body weight ratio, testicular cholesterol, sialic acid, glycogen, acid phosphatase, and gamma glutamyl transferase activities, while there was significant decrease in the activities of testicular alkaline phosphatase, acid phosphatase, glutamate, blah, 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 blah. So basically what we found at the end of this study in conclusion was that only the 18 milligram per kilogram dose, which is the dose normally recommended for use by the herb sellers in traditional medicine on the parameters of testicular function, suggests transient toxicity and may be relatively safe. The other dosages were not as benign, and in a dose-dependent manner, we saw essentially the destruction of the seminiferous tubules, which is, you know, very concerning. If you have like literal testicular toxicity occurring in a dose-dependent manner, like who cares what the testosterone increases are? If testicles are just like fucking, you know, disintegrating into nothingness, it's kind of obviously the ROI is not there. So anyways, recoveries were made by the animals on some of the testicular function indices, mainly at 18 milligrams per kilogram body weight. Alterations brought about by the extract Fadogia Agrestis stem are indications of adverse effect on the male testicular function. This may adversely affect the functional capacity of the testes. Recovery made at 18 milligrams per kilogram suggests it does not exhibit permanent toxicity. So again, the first thing I wanted to discuss about this before we get into, actually we should go over the rest of them. So we have this one too. This is the same dosage burdens for 28 days. And they were looking at the actual visual representation of seminiferous tubules. And we see here the photo micrograph of testes of rats administered distilled water. Then at the 18 milligram per kilogram dose, we have the 50 milligram per kilogram dose and 100 milligram per kilogram dose. And we see essentially the disintegration of seminiferous tubules with loss of germ cell attachment from the seminiferous epithelium. And moving on to the last marker, mode of cellular toxicity, assessing rat liver and kidney toxicity with Fadogia. And they basically found liver and kidney body weight ratios of extract treated animals compared well with their controls. Extract did not cause any swelling, atrophy, or hypertrophy of the organs. Other evidence in the study suggests disruption of the ordered lipid bilayer of the plasma membranes of the hepatocytes and nephrons. This might have resulted from peroxidation of polyunsaturated fatty acids on the membranes of the hepatocytes and nephrons, made possible by the functional groups or the product of metabolism of the extract. This may be responsible for the compromise of the integrity of the plasma membranes of the hepatocytes and nephrons. So obviously at a first glance, I'm like, damn, like, fuck, case closed. Like, I'm not gonna touch this shit. Like, the efficacy measures are impressive as hell, but the side effect profile, you know, obviously very concerning. And in general, from those that I've seen cover the toxicity data, there seems to be like a general disregard for the duration of exposure, which is something that kind of like, you know, lit up in my head. I was like, oh shit, like the efficacy measures, we had exposure of 5 days to get these massive spikes in total T and all of these like massive improvements in sexual health parameters, you know, actual arousal, you know, actual testicular testosterone production, blah, blah, blah. And these are metrics that ultimately, if you have like massive amounts of toxicity, you're not going to have improvements in metrics of fertility. You're going to have a deterioration of function and capacity to actually produce hormones and, you know, complete steroidogenesis processes. So we have this 18 milligram to 100 milligram dose having this massive spike in total T, and the dosages were used for 5 days, which doesn't seem very long. 5 days seems like nothing. It's like, what? Like, how much is that in human days? Which is what we're going to get into next, because the side effect profile data is using 28-day exposure. So I'm like, like what is the equivalent of this in human months or years or days or what? So basically what we see in actual rodent models in general is a lifespan of between 2 and 3 years in general. So that means if you have a rodent that is exposing themselves to a massive dose of something for a period of time, in adulthood, every day of the animal is approximately equivalent to 34.8 human days. So 1 rat month is comparable to 3 human years. So actually comparing not just the dosage burden, but also the duration of exposure, very, very prudent in my opinion for actually assessing the efficacy relative to side effect profile. Because again, I didn't want to write it off entirely, given how much Huberman spoke highly of it. Other individuals are kind of hopping on the hype train too, and kind of, really digging into how useful this stuff could be. And apparently a lot of people were finding use of it that were kind of trying to look for an orally bioavailable alternative to getting on exogenous hormones. Because again, exogenous hormones, once you're injecting this shit, you are reliant upon them. Whereas this is something that supports HPTA function or otherwise interacts with it in a way that does not deteriorate your hypothalamus ability to shoot out GnRH with then your pituitary output of LH and FSH and your testes responsiveness to that LH and FSH. Whereas if you're using exogenous hormones, eventually you're going to have such a diminished response to gonadotropin output, you may indeed experience some level of like primary testicular failure, whereby gonadotropin signaling is not even sufficient to stimulate anything because you've not used them for so fucking long. They've been just chilling there without any stimulation at all, atrophied to the point of basically being useless. Whereas for this, if you would be somebody who is trying to find that in between, like this may be, it had actual therapeutic promise in my opinion. So I was like really trying to parse out this literature, because again, I always thought this stuff was bullshit, to be honest. So I was like, when I saw people speaking highly of it that I respected, I was like, okay, like maybe I'm fucking wrong. So digging into it further, I was like, okay, the actual dosage burden and the duration of exposure, again, 1 day equals 34.8 human days, 1 rat month is comparable to 3 human years. So we have the actual efficacy model of 5 days of exposure equating to about 5 to 6 months of human use, which I'm like, okay, like 5 to 6 months of human use, like no one would be using this stuff for that long. Well, I guess people did. I think Huberman might have actually too, and not cycled off. But in general, like people who are very, very careful about their, foray into this stuff would otherwise be doing some sort of like cycling protocol, whereby they're on it for a few weeks, then come off for a week, or on it for a couple months and come off for a week or something of that nature. But the side effect data, I'm like, okay, well, how long is this? What's the exposure? 28 days. So 1 rodent month, remember, equates to about 3 human years. So I'm like, okay, at a 18, 50, and 100 milligram per kilogram dose for 28 days, we have the equivalent exposure of humans using upwards of over, I don't know, what was the actual dosage equivalent? 550 on the low end to 1800 milligrams for 3 years straight, essentially. And I'm like, at that point, I was like, okay, maybe I will think about this a bit further, because this is like, seemed like a very exaggerated time frame, like being drawn out here. And I'm like, it's obviously logical for them to do this because they want to see like if it can be well tolerated in this kind of a scenario, then it's like, okay, the shit is like probably good to go. But they actually simulate a dramatic representation of like the worst case scenario, a super high dose with a super long duration of exposure, and see what goes on in the worst cases, as well as comparing, like these dosages are equivalent to the efficacy ones. So it's like, obviously, if you have toxicity at any of those dosages, it might be, wise to steer clear. But for me, I'm like, okay, again, this is a very context specific ingredient and just overall interfering with your HPTA in general, that I think this is something that the ROI should be weighed out intelligently based on your conclusions from stuff like this. So it's like, I'm not saying you should or shouldn't do something. Rather, I'm saying if you've done all of these lifestyle interventions, and it's like, I think Huberman said it better than I could have, that it's kind of like on you to assess these biomarker changes and assess if this is something that's worthwhile for you to pursue. Because ultimately, I think this does have significant viability for individuals at a much lower efficacious dose that is well tolerated at very responsible durations of exposure. Because again, if we're talking like a month of exposure, we're talking like 1 rat day, less than that. We're talking about like 1 rat day equals 34.8 human days. So ultimately, if the rat can make it through 1 day of a minimum efficacious dose, like, is that likely that with you taking it and then cycling off for an appropriate amount of time and then getting back on it, you might be able to realize the benefits of it without the side effect profile at a dosage that is a much more reasonable entry point. And maybe you don't get those 6-fold increases in total test, but rather you reserve testicular function and you don't end up with deterioration of seminiferous tubules down the line because you're not staying on it for fucking 3 years straight at a mega dose. So I'm like, okay, like at this point I'm digging into it further and I'm thinking, is there other examples of actual fertility aids that showed the same deterioration of seminiferous tubules? Because I don't know about you guys, but I've in the past used Novadex, Clomid, HCG. I've used all these things. These are human approved drugs and they work quite fucking well at what they do. And I'm like, like the same sort of interaction with the HPTA, although different mechanisms of action, but worth digging into nonetheless. I'm thinking, do human approved drugs in rodent data show these same kind of damage toxicity metrics? So I started to dig into it further. I looked into it. I found a tamoxifen study on the testes of albino male rats. I'm like, okay, this is the exact same rodent model essentially. We have albino male rats here being exposed to Novadex, a drug that is human approved and you may have used and I've used too. So here they used 40 mature albino rats divided into 4 equal groups. 3 groups were administered different doses, 30 milligrams per kilogram, 40, 50 for 10 weeks, as well as control group administered with physiologic solution. Histopathological examination of testes tissue in the tamoxifen treated group showed histological changes that increased with the increased dose. Compared to control group include degeneration change, where appeared as atrophy, deformity, and destruction of the seminiferous tubules, congestion of blood vessels in the interstitial tissue, and many seminiferous tubules. Also, the results show a significant difference in the number of spermatogonia, primary spermatocyte cells, and spermatioids. As noted in the results, the higher the dose, the lower the sperm production, and consequently the tissue injury increases. So I'm like, at this point, I'm in a rabbit hole. I'm like, fuck, dude, like, this is a human approved drug I've used. Like, this is something that a lot of people have used and otherwise are like quite, trusting of for its efficacy outcomes relative to the side effect profile. And I'm noticing a consistent increase a consistent pattern as I start to get into this like fertility drug data, is that at some dosage burden, actual destruction of seminiferous tubules occurs and actual testicular function actually deteriorates. But in unison, you see these metrics change with lower sperm production. Like the actual functional capacity of the testicles goes down as you would expect when the structural integrity like deteriorates. So I'm like, okay, is this happening with everything, including HCG? Because this is something that is obviously very comparable when we're comparing something that improves LH output and potentially even LH receptor expression in the testicles. Is HCG doing this too? Because this is something that like the main go-to fertility drug that works very fucking well at what it does for intratesticular testosterone production. Like what is that doing in rodents too? So I kept going and I made it, through multiple other studies. This was a study on Novadex too. In juvenile males, has long-term adverse effects in the reproductive system. Low dose tamoxifen. Here we found that a single dose of Novadex, less than 10% of the mean dose used for recombination induction, caused adverse effects to the testes and to the reproductive endocrine system that persisted long term. These data raise significant concerns about the widespread use of Novadex induction of recombination, the use of tamoxifen for induction of recombination, and highlight the importance of including appropriate controls in all pathophysiological studies using this means of induction. And here we see seminiferous tubules with tamoxifen results in dose-dependent seminiferous tubule atrophy and therefore decreased fertility. Long-term adverse effects on male reproductive function are also well established to occur after neonatal administration of tamoxifen, including reduced testes and seminal vesicle size and a reduction in fertility due to impaired spermatogenesis and decreased seminiferous tubule diameter. So this was a single tamoxifen injection at range of doses and at a low dose of treatment. Moving on to Clomid data in humans. This is where I was like really getting into the weeds here. I'm like, okay, Clomid, something that many of us would use many of us maybe would use enclomiphene instead. But anyways, like a very, very tried and true fertility drug, like widespread. Fucking millions of people use this shit and it's approved in humans. This is a human approved dose, 50 milligrams per kilogram for 6 months. So not a short duration, but for rodents, this is like fucking 2 days, bro. Or like, what is it? 6 months is like, sorry, this is like, I don't know, like 5 or 6 days or whatever it is. Like it's 34.8 days per day. So we're looking at, like roughly, I don't know, a handful of days-ish. So 50 milligrams per day, a very, very like benign human, well-tolerated dose. And this is in humans, a 33-year-old azoospermic patient with a previous history of repeated fresh TESE, testicular sperm extraction, and clomiphene citrate therapy undergoing microscopically assisted bilateral testicular biopsy. And what they found is on the seminiferous tubules, we showed no tubular lumen or regularly seminiferous epithelium, but a great number of spermatogonia-like cells. These cells proved to be normally differentiated, negative for placental alkaline phosphatase with increased proliferative activity and a slightly higher rate of apoptotic cells. When compared to a tissue control with normal spermatogenesis, expression of sex hormones, receptors, androgen receptor, ER, and G-coupled estrogen receptor 1 was not altered in patient samples. Sertoli cells appeared to be mature, whereas the expression of zona occludens in protein 1, Claudin 11, connexin 43 was absent or dislocated in the tubules with abundance of spermatogonia. So basically we see excessive unilateral proliferation in a patient with non-obstructive azoospermia, adverse effect of Clomid pre-treatment ? This is a human improved dose. I'm not saying this is even comparable necessarily in this study to the seminiferous tubule destruction we see at the max dose of Fadogia in like a 3-year human exposure model, which like it's a rodent model that is the equivalent of like 3 years or whatever it was. However, this is where I went like even deeper. I'm like, okay, time to look at HCG data. Acute HCG administration induces seminiferous tubule damage in the adult rat. So here I'm seeing again, I'm like, okay, is this going to be dose-dependent changes? Because it seems like there is, again, any pro-fertility drug, some Goldilocks level where you have improvement in all parameters, and then anything above and beyond that where you have like excess Leydig cell stimulation above and beyond the capacity of the structural integrity of the actual organ, or any sort of like functional stimulation that is above and beyond the capacity of it. You start to lead to deterioration, proliferation of like fucking cancer cells, like all this stuff that you don't want. And that's why there is a certain sweet spot whereby your body like maintains a self-regulated like feedback loop to not induce some like hyper level of exposure whereby you end up with like cancerous balls and whatnot. And again, HCG bypasses the feedback loop entirely. So that's why you can just have like an unfiltered hammering of the Leydig cells above and beyond what you would ever get from pituitary output. So here, in order to study the early effects of an HCG stimulation on the seminiferous tubules of the adult rat, a single dose of 100, 200, and 400 units HCG was administered to 80 to 90-day-old rats of the Sherman strain. Histological analysis revealed a tubular damage already noticeable 6 hours after the injection. I was like, wow. The precocious lesion becomes more pronounced 2 to 5 days later, consisting of degeneration, hypocellularity of the germinal epithelium, margination of the chromatin in round spermatids, and formation of multinuclear giant cells. This damage involves big areas of the testes, particularly the peripheral location. Analysis performed 3 months after acute stimulation still showed tubular regressive changes, thus indicating an incomplete reversion of the damage. Changes in the hormonal environment of HCG-treated rats were found. Serum testosterone levels significantly increased from 6 to 72 hours following a 200 IU HCG injection. Severe diminution of serum FSH levels and significant increase of the serum estradiol were observed. Intratesticular administration of estradiol benzoate was able to reproduce the tubular damage in some animals, while restoration of FSH circulating levels by simultaneous administration of HCG and purified FSH did not prevent the changes induced by HCG alone. These results suggest that the high intratesticular level of estradiol and not the lowering of serum FSH might be the mechanism responsible for the described testicular injury. Another study on HCG, effects of human chorionic gonadotropin on the testes of adult albino rats. Again, the same rats that are used in the Fadogia data. 80 adult albino rats separated into 4 groups, 3 treated, 1 control. 10, 50, 100 IU per kilogram, while the controls received normal saline. It's getting hard to talk right now. The doses were given twice weekly for 3 months via subcutaneous injections. Subsequently, on day 1, 30, 60, and 90 post-therapy, blood samples and testes were obtained for evaluation. Low dose of HCG caused increased number of germ cells and Sertoli cells. Contrary, higher doses decreased their population, resulted in exfoliation of the germ cells. Furthermore, reduction in the thickness of the tubular basement membrane, congestion of the intertubular blood vessels, and interstitial bleeding were observed in the higher dose groups. Literally fucking bleeding in the testicles because of this over-exacerbated stimulation. All the doses caused interstitial edema, hyperplasia, and hypertrophy of the Leydig cells, as well as diminution in the collagen fibers. All these changes were reversible within 3 months. Only the low doses of, this is the conclusion, only the low doses of HCG stimulate spermatogenesis, whereas higher doses suppress sperm production. So again, like ultimately what I saw consistently when I was digging into this was anything that's pro-fertility, pro-intratesticular testosterone sperm production, was ultimately going to have some level of a low effective dose and then escalation, some level whereby you are exceeding the ROI on the benefit and actually inducing regression and damage from the structural deterioration of the actual organ. So here, again, you have no bottleneck on stimulation of HCG. Like, you are literally hammering Leydig cells. And again, with Fadogia, we see up to super physiological levels of LH2 in some cases, apparently. So you could, hypothetically, you're not going to get to HCG level territory because HCG, you could just escalate the dose forever and bypass the pituitary entirely. But with Fadogia, if you get increased, like I said before, LH receptor expression, as well as at the pituitary level, increased LH to like slightly super physiological ranges, like obviously you're at a level where maybe the duration of exposure could potentially put you in like a proliferative, deteriorative, if that's a word, deterioration inducing state, because you are essentially stimulating the Leydig cells too much. So that is what I see consistently in the data, especially among the comparable studies in rodents, is it seems like there is some level that stimulates like heightened fertility metrics, whereby your balls can actually handle the stimulation. But when you exceed that functional capacity of them, you start to get into toxicity territory, where you have deterioration of all of your fertility metrics, and the actual structural integrity literally falls apart. You get like bleeding in the testicles and like all this wild shit, cancer cell development, blah, blah, blah. So I'm like, damn, like this made me rethink my conclusion on Fadogia, because at first I was like I don't even know if I've done a video on Fadogia itself, but I was like relatively critical of testosterone boosting ingredients in the first place. Mainly aromatase inhibition is still not a big fan. You know, in certain contexts I understand it, but ultimately with this like modulation of the HPTA, it seems as though as long as you're choosing the right targets, so pituitary output, I think is a logical target if you're bypassing the feedback system and you get to selectively increase LH at the pituitary level. Like, that's a fucking unreal thing. Like, potentially guys on gear could even maybe maintain some pituitary stimulation and subsequent Leydig cell stimulation with that, with like an orally bioavailable, like, it's not HCG necessarily, which is like, you know, what I was almost led to believe initially when I kept hearing LH mimic or HCG mimic, but seemingly being able to bypass the system whereby you have shut down LH and FSH, you might be able to stimulate some heightened level of LH output, even in suppressed individuals, but mainly, like, that's kind of a stretch as if it's gonna work in anabolics users, but mainly for naturals who are looking for optimization. This seems to be something that at a low level, a benign, hopefully well-tolerated level, you could get increased LH output and sufficient Leydig cell stimulation to get back up to a more high level testosterone level that provides more, you know, neurological benefits, performance benefits, blah, 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 without getting into this toxicity territory. So again, that's why I was very mindful of the dosage titration in this and allowing it to be broken down into 1, 2, 3, 4 capsule increments before you even get to the territory where you're even in the ballpark of, you know, data showing like max dose toxicity outcomes. So for this, you know, for me, I see like a 1 capsule entry level dose may even be worthwhile for some people. 2 capsules where you get into actual efficacy metric territory, as well as also being mindful of side effect territory too. And this is where it is kind of prudent. And again, as I've probably mentioned multiple times now, it would be something that I would highly encourage you to stay on top of your metrics. This is not a product that I think random people should just be jumping on haphazardly to try and crank their T up. This is for people who are actually trying to optimize and have tried all areas to optimize and could not get to where they need to be, whereby they have tried the lifestyle optimization, diet, you know, you're hitting all your nutrient needs, blah, blah, blah. Obviously, some things are harder to hit than others, like magnesium, and is why it is featured in this product to begin with. But ultimately, your sleep hygiene is not shit. You're not excessively hitting yourself with stimulants late at night. You are, you know, getting, I don't know, shifting into a parasympathetic state and not, you know, eating a shit ton of food before bed. You're not taking stims too late, like I said. You are avoiding blue light at nighttime. You're not, I don't know, you're just following an overall like conducive lifestyle to hormone production. You know, cortisol levels are managed through a relatively balanced life, but ultimately some individuals deal with many stressors that are above and beyond their control. That's where things like ashwagandha and Tongkat may be useful. Other individuals have tried maximizing everything and still they have, you know, low normal LH levels. These are things that I think may have potential intertwinement with the efficacy of something like this, but it is a context specific product. And the Fadogia specifically Tongkat and Ashwagandha have a lot more human literature to support its efficacy and safety profile, but be mindful of this Fadogia. So don't just consider the efficacy data, also consider the toxicity data, because we have seen not very much like description of it. I've seen like a couple, YouTube videos here and there, but I haven't seen anybody really dig into it as well as outline the potential Goldilocks zone whereby any sort of Leydig cell stimulatory compound can lead to structural integrity loss. Because I think that seems to be, at least my speculation, what's happening here is there's some super physiological LH hammering Leydig cells, which ends up leading to some structural integrity loss at a high level, whereby you also potentially get expression increase at the receptor level and this hammering at a level that is exceeding what would otherwise be needed to optimize testosterone. You're getting into like heightened supraphysiological territory that is not only maybe in the short term, you might see a burst of T that is like insane, like over the top, like borderline low dose cycle territory. But at some level, like the structural foundation of these organs can't sustain that and end up having like fucking bleeding in your balls and like all this weird crazy shit that you don't want to happen. So that is, be mindful of the dose, be mindful of the efficacy, it looks fucking cool, but also be mindful of the side effect profile. So cycling is prudent, again, considering the rodent duration of exposure. These are not individuals, these are rodents that were hit with this stuff for upwards of 5 days in the efficacy metrics, but also for upwards of 28 days. So but the comparison of like 6 months to like 3 years essentially for the rodent models, when you actually break it down again, 2 and 3 year lifespan, 5 to 6 months, 1 day equaling 34.8 human days. So like I would not be using this stuff for months on end, just put it that way. So that is why I think this is a hyper conservative suggested use, but I think it's a warranted hyper conservative use because of this data. Because again, like we don't actually know if toxicity metrics occurred at day 20 that were just as bad as 28 necessarily. We just speculate that this was like the hyper end extreme outlier scenario where they used the highest doses, high duration of exposure, where it's equivalent essentially to 3 human years, and they got these, deterioration of seminiferous tubules, and you don't want that to happen. So obviously don't use this shit if this concerns you, and if you're going to be using it and you see the ROI on it potentially worthwhile and you do an intelligent titration of dose, stay on top of your biomarkers, stay on top of your LH and FSH level, stay on top of your semen parameters. Like these are all things to be prudent of, and you can actually assess directly if this is having a negative effect on you in real time. And if it is, taper the dose back or get off entirely. And if it's not affecting you negatively, stay on top of it still, but just be mindful of this stuff in the back end. So I hopefully, elucidated that sufficiently, and it was something that, I was hypercritical of in the past, very, very skeptical of. I thought most of these ingredients were total horseshit, and to be honest, most of them are, but it seemed like there was certain things that actually had therapeutic promise. And, again, big thanks to all the individuals who had insight on this ingredient and Tongkat and some of the more like exotic integrations and mechanisms of action of those compounds that actually, influence the creation of this product ultimately, because these are things like I needed assistance to really feel confident parsing out this literature and understanding like what is going on at the mechanistic level, receptor activation level, and figure out like how to intelligently and responsibly approach this for human equivalency. So anyways, I think it's very, very promising and worthwhile for certain individuals, but you have to be mindful of the pros and cons of it. So hopefully I elucidated that sufficiently, and you guys, feel more informed when you make your decision. You don't just haphazardly jump into something like TRT, but you also don't haphazardly jump into supplementation with exotic and relatively obscure compounds. So now we are going to move on to the Tongkat Ali data. This is a compound that seems to act like a SERM, selective estrogen receptor modulator, is comparable to tamoxifen in some data, but something that became notable to me is its modulation of SHBG, something that I also gave a little bit of pushback on the Huberman podcast too. I was like, doesn't it? I was like, I don't really, like, what kind of changes do you see in free test levels compared to Total T? Do you see the manipulation of your SHBG that significant? Because it seemed like there was more than one mechanism of action. I really wanted to get to the bottom of it. And it seems like the primary understanding of how it works is potentially through SHBG manipulation to some extent. But in addition to that, it acts as a mild kind of like makeshift SERM, like tamoxifen. But anecdotally, and I've been watching this shit for years, like I have been aware of Tongkat since I started posting content online. I've seen tons of individuals use it. tons of feedback that you can find online. I have not seen one case of ocular damage, which is something that you see with chronic exposure to Novadex. But at the same time, that's where cycling comes in. Individuals who are using tamoxifen nonstop for actual clinically warranted reasons though too, they're using like a hardcore pharmacologic aid in order to, inhibit estrogen receptor activation. You see individuals rarely, but sometimes end up with, eye damage. Is this something that is occurring with cycling, with intelligent dosing schedules? I would imagine very, very infrequently. Something to be aware of, that it has a similar overlapping mechanism though. But in the data, I do not see any side effects related to SERM activity in Tongkat. Anecdotally, do we see individuals end up with low estrogen type side effects? It seems like in some cases, individuals who are using too high of a dose or individuals who are using it for too long without cycling off at all, they end up with, achy joints. It starts to cause, things that you would associate with low estrogen. And, ultimately that would affect things like erectile quality, libido, stuff that you would expect from low estrogen, almost similar to aromatase inhibition, but this is something that would be avoided through ideal dosing parameters and exposure and cycling. So getting into the mechanism, it seems like it's the modulation potentially of SHBG, either through literally occupying it or inhibiting it to some extent. It's not really clear what this is. It also seems to work through enhancing steroidogenesis and conversion from pregnenolone to downstream actual sex hormones. So it seems to increase the production of testosterone through induction of steroidogenic acute regulatory protein. It's kind of odd how it seems to work. And it's kind of expediting or exacerbating the cascade of steroid production. It's kind of odd, but it seems to have interactions with CYP enzymatic function that actually convert cholesterol and downstream sex hormones to their byproduct androgens like testosterone. If you've ever seen the steroidogenesis chart, it's way at the bottom. These are things that are facilitated through multiple fucking enzymatic processes, and it seems to literally enhance CYP 17 alpha hydroxylase 1720 lyase. I would have to go look back at what that was exactly, but some sort of enzymatic upregulation essentially in the steroidogenesis cascade. I don't know how potent it really is at that, but ultimately it seems to be a tangent, three-pronged effect of some sort of SHBG interaction, steroidogenesis through enzymatic upregulation of some context, and SERM activity. I think the primary MOA personally is SERM activity in a mild enough context that I do not see the manifestation of significant side effects to a point that I'm totally writing off the compound. So anyways, getting into the actual potency of it, this was a randomized clinical study on the use of freeze-dry water extract of Eurycoma longifolia, which is, Tongkat Ali, also known as Long Jack, for the improvement of quality of life and sexual well-being in men. So the dosage we are using is Tongkat Ali 200:1, which is the most potent standardization, and specifically sourced from Indonesia as opposed to Malaysia. I made sure everything was in line with Huberman's recommendations and was the most potent formulation possible, essentially, for if this was gonna work, this is what's gonna fucking move the needle. So this is reputed as an aphrodisiac and a remedy for decreased male libido. A randomized double-blind placebo-controlled parallel group study was carried out to investigate the clinical evidence of Tongkat in men. So these are human studies, fortunately. The 12-week study in 109 men between 30 and 55 years of age consisted of either treatment of 300 milligrams of water extract or placebo. Primary endpoints were quality of life, sexual well-being, erectile function, sexual health care questionnaires, seminal fluid analysis, fat mass safety profiles. What they found at the end was higher scores in overall erectile function, sexual libido, sperm motility, semen volume. Certain subjects also, significantly improved fat loss through the improvement in fat mass lost. All safety parameters were comparable to placebo. So ultimately this stuff was, no notable side effects that were worrying, and it was efficacious at improving fertility metrics, which is what we want to see. And that was at a 300 milligram dosage. So again, I don't know if I mentioned already, but we have 400 milligrams in the 4 capsule dose, 300 milligrams in the 3 capsule dose, 200 milligrams 2 capsule dose, 100 milligrams on 1 capsule dose. So this is the 400 milligram dose is kind of the top end, potent as fuck dose that Huberman talked about and is reinforced in the data. And that is what is featured in our like max 4 capsule dose as well. But again, minimum efficacious dose for achieving what you're trying to get out of it. Because again, this is not going to be side effect free, even though in these studies, you're barely going to find side effects because Tongkat seems very well tolerated. And there's fortunately a lot of human literature to make us very, very confident in its use. But it doesn't mean it's not going to have some side effects in some individuals. You know, at a 400 milligram dose or higher, you know, it's going to be potentially problematic with chronic exposure. So that is why you cycle it as outlined in the suggested use. And you use the minimum efficacious dose. So that's where you use like an entry level 2 capsule dose where you're using 200 milligrams. And you kind of titrate up as needed based on biomarkers, based on semen parameters, based on all that shit. Here, another study. Tongkat Ali and managing idiopathic male infertility. Study investigated the effect of treatment with the proprietary standardized water-soluble extract of the root of the Malaysian plant Tongkat Ali, thought to enhance male fertility with regard to higher semen volume, sperm concentrations, percentage of normal sperm morphology, and sperm motility in male partners of subfertile couples with idiopathic infertility. 350 patients were given 200 milligrams of Tongkat and followed up. Semen analysis were performed every 3 months for 9 months. So again, this is a compound that is, even in the studies, shown to have good duration of exposure side effect profile. So even individuals who are using this shit for months on end with no cycling had no significant side effects, which is very, very confidence inspiring in my opinion. So of these 350 patients, 75 patients completed 1 full cycle of 3 months. Follow-up semen analysis in these patients showed significant improvement in all semen parameters. The proprietary extract of Tongkat Ali significantly improved the sperm quality in these patients, allowing for 11 spontaneous pregnancies. So pretty fucking cool. Individuals who, you know, idiopathic male infertility, managing it with Tongkat Ali at a 200 milligram dose for months on end, you know, well tolerated and getting, you know, chicks pregnant. Fucking right on with what we want to see. Another study, this was standardized water-soluble extract of Tongkat as testosterone booster for managing men with late-onset hypogonadism. So, in most countries, millions of people are relying on herbal medicines as remedy for numerous ailments. In Southeast Asia, Tongkat Ali, also known as Malaysian ginseng or Tongkat Ali, well, I should have just fucking read it as this, but you know, I'm just gonna say Tongkat Ali for every single version of the word. So like, who wants to say this? Euricoma longifolia jack. Tongkat Ali is used to combat stress and disease and to improve physical strength. Moreover, the compounds of the roots of this plant are reported to have aphrodisiac and testosterone enhancing effects in the rat. Considering that human studies are not available, 76. Now again, keep in mind that this is, I'm going in like chronological order of the availability of the studies. So these are coming out over time and I'm kind of going through them one at a time here. Like this was 2010. And some of the ones I went over prior to that were actually this was a 2010 study as well. This was a 2012 study. So actually it wasn't chronological order. So when they say, considering that human studies are not available, just keep in mind human studies came out after this point. This was one of the ones that I guess inspired a lot of the interest in it and then led to this one that we went over, this one that we went over, and soon to be more that we're gonna go over. So I actually probably should have put this before the other two we just went over in humans. But anyways, that's if you're wondering why they said that, because I realized I should have moved that tab over a few notches here before those other studies. So my mistake on that. But anyways, so here, this is one of the early studies. Considering that human studies are not available, 76 of 320 patients suffering from late stage onset hypogonadism were given 200 milligrams of Tongkat Ali for 1 month. So this is, you know, the first study in humans. Aging male symptoms according to the standardized rating scale and the serum testosterone concentration were taken. Results showed that treatment of LOH, late on stage hypogonadism patients with this Tongkat Ali extract significantly improved the AMS, aging male symptom score, as well as the serum testosterone concentration. While before treatment, only 10.5% of the patients did not show any complaint according to the AMS scale and 35.5% had normal test levels. After completed treatment, 71.7% and 90.8% of the patients showed normal values, respectively. Thus, Tongkat Ali appears to be useful as a supplement in overcoming the symptoms of LOH and for management of hypogonadism. So you literally had a doubling of patients getting to normal testosterone levels. Here we had, again, well actually here, no, we had while before only 10.5% of patients did not show any complaint according to the AMS scale, 35.5 had normal test levels, completed treatment, 71.7 and 90.8. So 90.8 from 35.5. Like this is very, very significant normalization of testosterone levels and worth considering for sure. And this is only 200 milligrams for a duration of, 1 month, sorry. So Tongkat Ali for 1 month at 200 milligrams. Very, very fucking good. Moving on to the next study, we have the effect of Tongkat Ali on the regulation of reproductive hormones in young males. So young men here, notably. So this is aimed to assess Tongkat Ali on the HPTA, well, I guess hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis to differentiate and specify, like sometimes it's called HPGA, which is probably more technically accurate, but gonads, testicles, you know what we're talking about here. HPGA and the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis. So your adrenal glands, there is a feedback loop for that as well. In healthy young males, since this might promote functional testosterone prowess, 32 males, 24.4 plus minus 4.7 years, notably. Like this is young as fuck. In a placebo-controlled double-blind match-paired study, received 600 milligrams of Tongkat per day or placebo for 2 weeks. Blood analysis using repeated measures analysis of variance showed significant interaction and time effects for testosterone, free testosterone, and estradiol levels in favor of the treatment group, while luteinizing hormone, follicle-stimulating hormone, and sex hormone binding globulin did not. The lack of changes in LH and FSH suggested a lesser role played by Tongkat in activating the HPGA in young adults. The raised testosterone level may be due to a greater rate of hormone production via the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. So again, even if you castrated yourself and literally snipped your nuts off, you would have some residual testosterone production from your adrenal glands. This is where you have the castrati. You have, some base level of testosterone production via, DHEA synthesis and downstream testosterone production. This is at the adrenal gland level. You will have some residual androgen production. It's not really backdoor. I don't know what you'd really call it from an endocrine perspective, but it's ultimately not facilitated from your brain to your nuts. It's in your adrenals, and you have some trace androgen production from that. And that can be contributing to some extent to your overall serum levels for sure. That does ultimately contribute to them. All but much more negligible because the majority of your testosterone is produced in your nutsack. The adrenal glands are still a very potent area of your body for producing hormones, and women, specifically get a lot out of it from an androgen perspective, and men lesser so, but still, if you have an upregulation of production there, this is contributing to your overall androgen load. And especially, you see the difference in, the hypogonadal men and whatnot in the previous study, that was fucking a monumental difference. That difference of 35.5 to 90+% individuals having, adequate levels, that's fucking significant to a point that I think, again, this plays into the multiple mechanisms of action of Tongkat. Because if you see no increase in LH or FSH, it's okay, well, there's no negative feedback occurring necessarily. Or is there? And it's negligible or somewhat balanced throughout all of these different pathways. It's kind of weird because you see in some individuals responding a little bit differently from their hormone profile, but ultimately it seems like there is some interaction potentially with the adrenal axis, some interaction with the CYP enzymatic upregulation, some interaction with the SERM perspective, some interaction with the SHBG modulation in some individuals. It's kind of like a multifaceted product that seems to have multiple different mechanisms of action. No one's really clear on what's going on, but it seems to fucking work well and is well tolerated in multiple individuals and in men who are suffering with low T or, are looking for a boost. It seems to work well. It seems more likely that individuals who are healthy producing males get a much lesser benefit out of it though, because you had 32 males who were young on 600 mgs and they had, boost in T, but it's not it doesn't seem as significant as the, previous studies in men who otherwise get it's kind of in line with what Huberman says. He says the low T individuals saw massive changes, some of them did, whereas the people that were healthy functioning, would see a 100 to 200 point increase. That seems basically what's represented in the literature as well from what we see here. Supplementation of Tongkat for 2 weeks demonstrates steroidogenic effects on young men were dose related. Consequently, the raised testosterone following Tongkat supplementation could benefit muscle and strength gain in young adults. So this was a study using, 600 milligrams, which is a high dose, and it was well tolerated and worked well enough. Nothing really fucking works in this industry as far as testosterone supplementation that isn't fucking with your system on a aromatase inhibition level or something like that. This seems to be a very, very broad spectrum product that is potentially useful even for young individuals, but very useful notably for individuals who are actually requiring testosterone optimization. So just interesting to see it applied in young men though, and still having utility, because you will not see that very often across a lot of, even like the fucking minerals. Like if you're deficient in minerals, like yeah, supplementing with magnesium, zinc, helpful, will get your testosterone production up. But if you are adequate in these hormones, or in these minerals, no, like you're not going to see a massive boost in T. But with Tongkat, it's not a necessity to have in your body whatsoever. Even young, healthy, functioning men who have like maxed out fucking top tier HPTAs still getting a boost from this stuff, really reinforces its legitimacy in my opinion. I was very, very surprised to see that data personally. Another study, effect of Tongkat Ali on stress hormones and psychological mood state in moderately stressed subjects. Here we had individuals that were stress hormones and mood state in 63 subjects, 32 men, 31 women screened for moderate stress and supplemented with a standardized hot water extract of Tongkat Ali root or placebo for 4 weeks. Significant improvements were found in the Tongkat Ali group for tension, confusion, stress hormone profile, salivary cortisol and testosterone were significantly improved by Tongkat Ali supplementation with reduced cortisol exposure. These results indicate that daily supplementation with Tongkat Ali extract improves stress hormone. I almost can't even talk now. I've been talking for so long. Stress hormone profile and certain mood state parameters, suggesting that this ancient remedy may be an effective approach to shielding the body from the detrimental effects of modern chronic stress, which may include general day-to-day stress, as well as the stress of dieting, sleep deprivation, exercise training. So again, another potential mechanism of action of Tongkat Ali, modulation of cortisol levels and actual stress response, which is actually the main mechanism of action of ashwagandha, which is another ingredient in here. It's probably the only other ingredient besides boron, which we're going to get to shortly as well, that is actually useful at modulating testosterone production. And this is a result of the manipulation of cortisol production and your response to it from a HPTA, HPGA standpoint overall. So we could just fit in 300 milligrams in here, which is a efficacious dose. But, you might be able to get away with more, but this is something that can be, a little bit hepatotoxic if you use it for too long. That's where the cycling recommendations come in, as well as if the dosage is way too burdensome. We chose a effective dose that we feel is perfect and honestly barely fucking fit to begin with in the product, because this thing's fucking stacked. Like I mentioned, the size, the capsule amount per bottle, we just fit it in here, and I thought it was a worthwhile thing to squeeze in. Because it's the only other thing that really moves the needle from the exotic, herbals category or botanicals or whatever the fuck you'd want to call it essentially. This is, one of the, ancient remedies that seems to be, highly hyped up, but is actually something that lives up to the hype in some context. So it has some performance enhancing elements that's found in the literature, and mainly the testosterone boosting components are the things that we are, most looking for out of this stuff. So this is Withania somnifera, which is ashwagandha, improves semen quality and stress-related male fertility. This study looked at stress has been reported to be a causative factor for male infertility, which is true, in my opinion. Withania somnifera has been documented in Ayurveda and Unani medicine system for its stress-combating properties. However, limited scientific literature is available on this aspect of ashwagandha. We undertook the present study to understand the role of stress in male infertility and to test the ability of it to combat stress and treat male infertility. We selected normozoospermic but infertile individuals, so 60 of them, further categorized into 3 groups: normozoospermic, heavy smokers, can almost not talk now, normozoospermics under physiological stress, and normozoospermics with infertility with unknown etiology. So again, when we say normozoospermic, they're talking about individuals with normal semen parameters, sperm counts. Normozoospermic fertile men were recruited as controls. These subjects were given ashwagandha powder at a rate of 5 grams per day. So it's just straight up powder, not standardized to any sort of amount of withanolides, which is what we do in this product. We make sure you get a potent standardization in there at a dose that is efficacious, so the actual amount needed can actually fit in a capsule rather than having to slam 5 grams of raw root. Measuring various biochemical and stress parameters before and after treatment suggested a definite role of stress in male infertility and the ability of ashwagandha to treat stress-related infertility. Treatment resulted in a decrease in stress, improved level of antioxidants, and improved overall semen quality in a significant number of individuals. The treatment resulted in pregnancy in the partners of 14% of the patients. Another study on ashwagandha, investigation into the stress relieving and pharmacological actions of an ashwagandha extract, a randomized double-blind placebo-controlled study. In this 60-day randomized double-blind placebo-controlled study, the stress relieving pharmacologic activity of ashwagandha extract was investigated in stressed, healthy adults. So I'm saying highlighting this on purpose because this is why the lower dosage is useful. 60 adults were randomly allocated to take either a placebo or 240 milligrams of a standardized ashwagandha extract once daily. Outcomes were measured using the Hamilton Anxiety Rating Scale, Depression, Anxiety, and Stress Scale, and hormonal changes in cortisol, DHEAS, and testosterone. So all participants completed the trial with no adverse events reported. So mindful of the fact this is a 2-month study essentially with no adverse events. In comparison with the placebo, ashwagandha supplementation was associated with a statistically significant reduction in the HAMA, so the Hamilton Anxiety Rating Scale, and a near significant reduction in the Depression, Anxiety, and Stress Scale. Ashwagandha intake was also associated with greater reductions in morning cortisol. So this is seen to be one of the main MOAs, is this reduction in morning cortisol and DHEAS compared with placebo. Testosterone levels increased in males, but not females over time, although this change was not statistically significant compared with placebo. So again, cortisol in the morning is something that gets you up and gets you going. This is not something you want to dull into nothingness. However, if you have like adrenal dysfunction, or you're like a highly stressed individual, having too high of cortisol levels not only keeps you in a sympathetically dominant state all day, which impairs recovery, but it fucks with your ability to actually produce androgens like testosterone. So testosterone levels increased in males, but not females over time, although this change was not statistically significant compared with the placebo. So these findings suggest that ashwagandha's stress relieving effects may occur via its moderating effect on the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis. However, further investigation utilizing larger sample sizes, diverse clinical and cultural populations, and varying treatment dosages are needed to substantiate these findings. So further literature digging into it, examining the effect of ashwagandha supplementation on muscle strength and recovery, randomized controlled trial. In this, they found that 8 weeks, so again, we're looking at almost 2 months approximately, in double-blind placebo-controlled clinical study, 57 young male subjects. So this is not old men that are, hypogonadal. This is in young, healthy men with little experience in resistance training were randomized into treatment and placebo. So some 29 were given ashwagandha, 28 were given placebo. Subjects in the treatment group consumed 300 milligrams of ashwagandha root extract twice daily, while the control group consumed starch placebos. Following baseline metrics, both groups underwent resistance training for 8 weeks, and measurements were repeated at the end of week 8. Primary efficacy measure was muscle strength. Secondary efficacy measures were muscle size, body composition, serum testosterone levels, and muscle recovery. So obviously off the bat, you're probably thinking, how is this relevant? Individuals with little experience in resistance training, obviously they're going to see newbie gains. How is this indicative of ashwagandha working? Well, they're comparing the results of newbie gains for individuals using ashwagandha versus not. So just wanted to make that clear. So compared to placebo subjects, treatment with ashwagandha had significantly greater increases in muscle strength on the bench press compared to placebo. So these are all individuals that are little experienced in training. No difference in that. It's just if they're taking ashwagandha or not. So bench press went up more with the ashwagandha plus exercise group. Leg extension went up as well with ashwagandha versus placebo. Significantly greater muscle size increase in the arms with ashwagandha versus placebo. Compared to the placebo subjects, the subjects receiving ashwagandha also had significantly greater reduction of exercise-induced muscle damage as indicated by the stabilization of serum creatine kinase. That's very interesting as well. Significantly greater increase in testosterone levels. So placebo, 18 nanogram per deciliter versus ashwagandha, 96.2 nanogram per deciliter, so almost 100 points. And a significantly greater decrease in body fat percentage, 1.5% for placebo versus ashwagandha, 3.5%. This study reports that ashwagandha supplementation is associated with significant increases in muscle mass and strength, and suggests that ashwagandha supplementation may be useful in conjunction with a resistance training program. So that is potent. That seems very, very worthwhile, in my opinion, or at least worth considering. Moving forward, we have this study here, effects of ashwagandha on reproductive system, a systematic review of the available evidence. Here, what they found at the end of this giant dissection of fucking information, essentially, is that the results deem that ashwagandha has a positive effect in the treatment of infertility, both in male and female, although some studies propose that ashwagandha extract might have infertilizing and spermicidal effect. again, be mindful of the dose, duration of exposure, because none of this shit is safe if used at mega doses or for long periods of time without breaks probably. Due to the growing interest in using herbal medicines, especially those which possess the antioxidative and reproductive system supporting properties, further studies are needed to be designed with higher population, more structured methodology, so a more precise and decisive conclusion can be made. So again, very promising data, but more literature, should be dug into, and you should definitely be mindful of staying on top of your biomarkers. Don't just assume that because a study shows some shit that you can just stay on it for 2 months straight and be fine. Assess your follow-up, liver enzymes, assess your semen parameters. If you want to be really following this regimen properly, if you're treating this like a foundational testosterone supporting supplement on a long-term basis, you should have baseline metrics and longitudinal data to actually assess that your tolerance to this dosage, it's actually efficacious and there is no side effects going on. So you have to do your own research and do your due diligence in that regard. Now finally, the last ingredient, we have boron citrate, 6 milligrams in the full 4 capsule dose, 3 milligrams in the 2 capsule dose. Why do I have boron in there? So boron is a product that is useful mainly for SHBG manipulation. The data on it is relatively limited, I guess. I don't know, it depends how much data you want to see. I've seen significant SHBG reductions anecdotally on it through tons of individuals, but the actual data on it, itself, all but limited, is very, very promising, and it led to a shit ton of people supplementing with boron over the years. And we've seen it time and time again, really pull through in what it does, which is essentially liberating testosterone from SHBG and freeing more into circulation for its psychoactive properties, muscle building properties, blah, 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 libido, etc. Because again, even if your total testosterone was 1,000, but your free test is fucking, 0.5% of your total or something, because you have so much SHBG and albumin bound testosterone, none of that is freely circulating to exert biological activity in target tissues. It's just fucking bound to this binding protein floating around in circulation, not actually getting to where it's intended to go to actually induce effects. So if you have again, with the carnivore diet, if you saw some of my videos criticizing chronic keto dieters, they see significant spikes in SHBG to a point that you have men with SHBG levels of females, and while they have normal total Ts oftentimes, if they don't cyclically introduce carbohydrates, they often end up in a state of borderline pseudo hypogonadism from lack of free testosterone. This is where the introduction of carbohydrates, at least in a cyclical manner, or just part of a balanced diet model, is prudent in my opinion for balancing and optimizing your hormone profile. But boron, some individuals, again, genetic predispositions, those looking to optimize, those who are, following a low carb diet, those who are following a calorie restricted diet. Sometimes individuals have imposed states of high SHBG that otherwise may need more management, and that's where boron comes into play. So it seems to be safe to supplement with and may have a significant effect on reducing SHBG and increasing bioavailable androgens, and it's just fucking tried and true from what I've seen. So getting into the data on it, we have comparative effects of daily and weekly boron supplementation on plasma, steroid hormones, and pro-inflammatory cytokines. Here they use acute supplementation with 11.6 milligrams of boron, resulted in a significant increase in plasma boron concentration. Let's see, here we have 8 healthy male volunteers. So again, this is why I said the data is somewhat limited. We have a small sample size, we have the data is impressive as fuck, but it's also limited. But that's where I've seen so much data over the years on boron that I know it is a useful supplement. And many of you are probably very familiar with it too. But anyways, this is one of the main studies that gets the most hype. 8 healthy male volunteers attended the laboratory on 3 occasions, days 0, 1, and 7. First day, blood sample collected at 8 a.m., followed by ingestion of placebo with breakfast. On the next day, supplementation day 1. Similar procedure, followed by ingestion of a capsule containing 10 milligrams of boron. Both occasions, blood was collected every 2 hours for the next 6 hours. Subjects were requested to consume a capsule of 10 milligrams boron every day with their breakfast. And on day 7, the blood collection was carried out at 8 a.m. again. Boron and plasma increased significantly following hours in weekly consumption. 6 hours of supplementation showed a significant decrease on SHBG. In addition, inflammatory metrics, high sensitive CRP, pro-inflammatory cytokines decreasing. So this is fucking all around. It's improving health metrics, as well as actually improving free tests. It seems this is why this study got so much hype. So 6 hours supplementation showed a significant decrease in SHBG, C-reactive protein decreasing, and TNF alpha also decreasing. After 1 week in samples taken at 8 a.m. only, mean plasma free test increased and the mean plasma estradiol decreased significantly. DHT, cortisol, and vitamin D was elevated. So again, DHT elevating, cortisol, and vitamin D. Notably though, also concentrations of all three inflammatory biomarkers decreased after supplementation. Of note, despite decreased pro-inflammatory cytokines based on recent clinical data, this might be the first human study report to show an increased level of free test after boron consumption. So people are probably wondering, like, why would DHT go up? It's because if you have estradiol decreasing, you're going to have an increased partition into the DHT pathway through 5-alpha reduction, likely the causative mechanism there. But that is just speculative on my part, but ultimately we see these changes in biomarkers, and the most notable being the change in free test being very, very significant, with a significant drop in SHBG concentrations. So here, if we go down to the actual SHBG manipulations, we see, starting points with placebo at 32.99, going all the way down to, 30 down, furthest down 29.4. And total testosterone levels versus free test, we see these manipulations of free test going as high as from up to 11.25 from a baseline of 8.55. So again, you see the distinct difference in free test levels on placebo. We have total tests actually decreasing by the end of the day because of diurnal rhythms likely. But again, free test levels 9.45, upwards of 9. Or 9.81, at the highest for the post, placebo administration, but no significant differences, of course, because SHBG levels are not really changing in a significant manner. We have 31.9, 32.5, 32.3. It's kind of just like, ebbing and flowing as normal diurnal rhythms would. Whereas for the supplementation group, we have 30.08 going down to 29.4 and causing the free test upward jump of 8.55 up to 11.25. And the notable thing being, the total test here does not significantly change at 2.63 to 2.69, but you still get that giant jump in free T despite total T staying the same. So that's where you see the binding protein manipulation, like clear as day, occurring, that allowed this liberation of testosterone into free circulation. So that is kind of where the hype comes around. But again, very limited data, obviously up for, a lot of error when you have like fucking 8 people and it's like very, not a very elaborate, setup or anything. And this is, but ultimately boron, I've seen tried and true through anecdotal experience. And it seems to be reinforced in the literature, all but, limitedly. So anyway, that is the breakdown of the product. A lot of time, research, skepticism, elaborate deep diving to kind of, extinguish that skepticism, and was met with further intrigue and actual massive amount of enthusiasm in seeing something that might actually fucking move the needle significantly in a natural supplementation context. Obviously huge shout outs to Andrew Huberman, Kyle Gillette, any other individuals that had input, Leo as well, Vigorous Steve, other individuals that provided valuable insight on this formulation in particular and helped in one way or another to bring it to life. And I am very happy to bring it to you guys, and I hope you guys who are actually looking for something like this, find utility in it, and context dependent who this is for. This is not for, 18, 19-year-old kids who are looking to fucking, have an alternative to steroids or some shit. This is for individuals who are looking to optimize their hormonal state, and especially for individuals who are on the low end of the natural spectrum. This could be highly useful, as you saw in the Huberman podcast, on Rogan, when I talked with them myself and dug into it. Individuals who see the most benefit are those who are a little bit deficient and otherwise could use a boost. And then individuals who are, healthy, otherwise healthy functioning, and young men too, they don't see as significant of a boost, but it seems like they may see something. But in general, this product was designed to be that in-between between you have optimized lifestyle, which everyone needs to do, get your fucking nutrients in, circadian rhythm, ideal sleep hygiene, blah, blah, blah. That's all dialed in. If you're still not where you need to be, before you go on exogenous hormones and stay fucking and commit to them for life, is there an in-between that actually works? This is a very, very thoroughly well thought out product that I think many of you will appreciate who context specifically, can make use of it. So if you want to check it out, Sigma is available for sale now. As you can see, a fucking shit ton of digging into unique literature went into me trying to really parse out this stuff and figure out if it was worthwhile to pursue in the first place. And I'm glad I did, because it seems like it could be a fucking hit product. Like, I'm actually very enthusiastic to see the response to this thing. So anyways, if you want to check it out, I'll put a link in the video description as well as the pinned comment. And thank you guys for your continued support. It felt really good to get back into one of these deep dive, like comprehensive fucking breakdown videos. This is probably gonna be my longest one yet. I remember my Gorilla Mode Nitric one was like an hour and a half. This one is going to be a fucking doozy, dude. So hopefully you guys enjoyed it if you made it to the end. And thank you guys for your continued support. Talk to you guys soon.